Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. When Daniel moved into his new apartment, he thought it was the beginning of a fresh start. The building was old, but it had a certain charm. High ceilings, wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and windows that overlooked the quiet street below. He had spent years saving up for a place like this, something he could call his own after years of renting cramped, noisy apartments in the city. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be home. The first few nights were peaceful. He settled in quickly, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting used to the new space. The only odd thing was the silence. Even though he lived in an apartment complex, he hardly ever heard his neighbors. No voices through the walls, no distant laughter, no television murmuring from the other units. It was strange, but he didn't mind. After all, he had lived in places where the noise never stopped, where thin walls let every conversation from next door bleed into his own space. This was better. Then, on the fourth night, he heard it. A sound from above. At first, it was just a faint shuffling, like someone moving around. Daniel thought nothing of it. The upstairs neighbor was probably adjusting furniture or walking around late at night. But the noise continued. A slow, deliberate pacing, back and forth. Daniel lay in bed, listening. He checked the time, 2:37 a.m. The footsteps didn't stop. It was strange, almost rhythmic, as if whoever was up there wasn't just walking, but following a pattern. A few steps forward, a pause, a few steps back. It made his skin crawl, but he tried to brush it off. Maybe the neighbor had trouble sleeping. Maybe they were restless. The next morning, Daniel left for work feeling groggy. He glanced up at the apartment above his as he walked to his car. The blinds were closed, and there were no signs of life. That night, it happened again. This time, the noise was louder. The footsteps were heavier, more deliberate. Daniel tried to ignore it, but then something new happened. He heard a soft tapping. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it was there. A gentle, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Daniel sat up in bed, his heart pounding. It almost sounded like it was coming from inside his own apartment. He turned on the bedside lamp, casting a warm glow over the room. He listened, straining his ears. Tap, tap, tap. His gaze moved toward the ceiling. The sound was coming from above. Daniel swallowed hard. Was his neighbor knocking on the floor? Were they trying to get his attention? But why would they be doing that in the middle of the night? He decided to ignore it. It was probably nothing, just some weird late-night habit. The next morning, after another restless night, Daniel decided to introduce himself to the upstairs neighbor. He climbed the stairs, reaching the door of apartment 302. He knocked 3 times and waited. Nothing. He knocked again. Still nothing. Daniel frowned. Maybe they weren't home. But then why had he heard them walking around just hours ago? He leaned in, pressing his ear against the door. Silence. He knocked one last time, harder. Finally, there was a sound, a faint shuffling from inside. Someone was in there. Daniel said, "Hey, sorry to bother you. I just moved in downstairs. I wanted to introduce myself." Silence. He cleared his throat and tried again. I've been hearing some noises at night. I just wanted to check if everything's okay." The shuffling stopped. Then a voice. Low, hoarse, and almost whisper-like. A man said, "Everything's fine." Daniel blinked. The voice sounded strange, almost strained. He hesitated before saying, "Oh, okay. Just wanted to make sure." Silence again. Then, the sound of slow footsteps retreating from the door. Daniel stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The interaction had been unnerving, but he didn't want to overthink it. Maybe the guy was just a private person. That night, Daniel went to bed early, determined to get some sleep. But at exactly 2:37 a.m., the pacing started again. This time it was worse. The footsteps were faster, almost frantic. And then, tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, insistent. Daniel sat up, his heart pounding. The tapping was coming from the same spot on the ceiling. He stared at it, his breath shallow. Then something new happened. A soft creaking noise, like a door opening. Daniel's skin prickled. The sound wasn't coming from his apartment. It was coming from upstairs. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, listening. The footsteps continued, shuffling toward where the tapping had come from. Then silence. Daniel held his breath. Then, a faint whisper. It was so soft he almost didn't catch it. A few muffled words, barely audible through the ceiling. He strained to listen. Then, clear as day, a voice said from above, "I see you." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He bolted upright, scrambling to turn on the light. His hands were shaking. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was he dreaming? No, he was awake. Daniel's breathing was rapid. He grabbed his phone and checked the time, 2:39 a.m. Just 2 minutes had passed since the pacing started. He didn't know what to do. His mind was screaming at him to leave. But where would he go? It was late. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe his neighbor was messing with him. But something about the voice, something about the way it had whispered those words. It wasn't normal. Daniel sat awake for the rest of the night, listening. The footsteps never returned. The tapping stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was upstairs knew he had heard them, and that terrified him. The next morning, Daniel felt like a ghost of himself. He hadn't slept at all. His eyes were bloodshot, his body ached, and his mind felt foggy. But more than anything, he was unsettled. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But after those whispered words, there had been only silence. No more pacing, no more tapping. It should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Daniel knew he couldn't ignore this anymore. He grabbed his keys and left the apartment, heading straight to the building manager's office. Inside, an older woman with short gray hair sat behind the desk, flipping through some paperwork. She glanced up as he walked in, offering a polite smile. She said, "Morning. You're the new tenant, right?" Daniel, was it? Daniel nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. He said, "Yeah. I just had a question about the apartment above mine. 302, do you know the guy who lives there?" The woman's smile faded slightly. She said, 302? Daniel nodded. She frowned, setting down her pen. She said, "There's no one in 302. Daniel felt a chill creep up his spine. He forced out a nervous laugh. He said, "No, that can't be right. I talked to someone up there yesterday. A man. I heard him moving around last night, too." The woman's expression darkened. She said, "That apartment's been empty for months. The last tenant moved out back in April. No one's rented it since." Daniel's stomach twisted. He said, "Are you sure? I knocked on the door yesterday. Someone answered." The woman shook her head. She said, "That's not possible." Daniel stared at her, his pulse hammering. He said, "Can I go up there? Just to check." The woman hesitated. She said, "I don't usually let tenants into unrented units, but I suppose I can make an exception." She stood, grabbing a set of keys from a drawer. Daniel followed her out of the office, his heart thudding with every step. They reached the 3rd floor, stopping in front of 302. The door looked just like his, plain, unremarkable. The woman inserted the key, twisted the lock, and pushed the door open. Daniel stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The apartment was empty, completely abandoned. No furniture, no belongings, just dust-covered floors and bare walls. But the worst part? The smell. A faint, musty odor hung in the air, something stale and forgotten. The woman said, "See? No one here." Daniel's throat was dry. He stepped further inside, looking around. It was identical to his unit, same layout, same windows. But something felt wrong. He walked toward the bedroom, hesitating at the doorway. The air felt heavier in here, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then he saw it. Near the far wall, right above where his own bed would be, were small, dark marks on the floor. Scuff marks, like someone had been pacing in that exact spot. Daniel swallowed hard. He turned back to the woman, his voice unsteady. He said, "Has anyone had access to this place recently?" The woman shook her head. She said, "Only me, and I haven't been up here in weeks." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He knew what he had heard last night. The footsteps, the tapping, the whisper. Something had been in this apartment. Or maybe it still was. That night, Daniel tried to convince himself it was all in his head. Maybe the noises had come from another unit. Maybe the whisper had been a trick of his tired mind. But when the clock hit 2:37 a.m., his stomach dropped. The pacing started again. Slow, deliberate steps above his bed. Daniel's breath hitched. He whispered to himself, "That apartment is empty." But the footsteps continued. And then, tap, 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 right above him. Daniel broke into a cold sweat. He said under his breath, "No, this isn't real." But then, a sound that made his blood freeze. A low, rasping breath. Not his. From above. It was faint, but it was there. A slow, deliberate inhale. Then that same whisper. The voice from last night. It said, "I see you." Daniel shot out of bed, heart pounding. He grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling to turn on the flashlight. He aimed it at the ceiling, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Silence. Then, a creak, but not from above. From inside his apartment. Daniel spun around, shining the light toward the corner of the room. His chest tightened. The closet door was open. Just a crack. He was sure, absolutely sure, he had closed it before bed. He swallowed hard, taking a slow step forward. The light trembled in his hands as he reached for the doorknob. He whispered, "Hello." Silence. He took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Empty. Just his clothes, hanging still and lifeless. Daniel let out a shaky breath, forcing a laugh. He whispered, "Losing my damn mind." But as he turned back toward the bed, something caught his eye. On the inside of the closet door, scratched into the wood, were 3 words. "I see you." Daniel dropped the flashlight. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. His skin crawled. That wasn't there before. His mind was racing. Had he somehow done this himself? Was he sleepwalking? No. The scratches were deep. Old. Someone had carved those words a long time ago. And then, from above, a quiet, slow laugh. Not loud, not mocking, just watching. Daniel's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. And as the hours dragged on, one terrifying thought kept creeping back into his mind. If the apartment upstairs was empty, then who the hell was watching him? Morning came like a distant dream. Daniel sat on his couch, staring blankly at the floor, his body too exhausted to move. The whispers, the laughter, the scratches on the closet door. It was all real. He needed answers. With shaking hands, he picked up his phone and searched the building's history. Maybe something had happened in 302. Maybe there was an explanation. But there was nothing. No reports. No news articles. No record of anything strange. He clenched his jaw. He said to himself, "If no one's talking, I'll find out myself." Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the apartment. He knocked on his neighbor's door. Apartment 301. A few seconds later, a middle-aged woman answered. Her face was lined with age, her eyes sharp and tired. She said, "Yes." Daniel hesitated, then asked, "Do you know anything about 302? The woman's face darkened instantly. She said, "Why?" Daniel swallowed. He said, I think someone's in there. The woman's grip tightened on the doorframe. She said, you shouldn't talk about it. Daniel's heart pounded. He said, talk about what? The woman looked past him, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, in a quiet voice, she whispered, he doesn't like it when people talk about him. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He said, who? The woman inhaled sharply. She whispered, the man upstairs. Daniel's breath caught. He asked, you've heard him too? The woman nodded stiffly. She said, we all have. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He asked, then why hasn't anyone done anything? Why hasn't anyone told the building manager? The woman gave him a sad look. She whispered, because it doesn't matter. No one ever believes us. And even if they did, he never leaves. Daniel's skin prickled. He asked, who is he? The woman's expression grew distant. She whispered, no one knows. He's always been here. Watching. Listening. Daniel's stomach twisted. He said, I need to see for myself. The woman's eyes widened in horror. She said quickly, no, you don't. Stay away from 302. Don't knock again. Don't speak to him. Pretend he isn't there. Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He said, but... The woman shook her head sharply. She whispered, you've already drawn his attention. The more you push, the worse it gets. She started to close the door, but before she did, she whispered one last thing. She said, whatever you do, don't let him in. Then the door shut. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, his skin crawling. He didn't realize how fast his heart was beating until he tried to take a breath. He whispered to himself, what the hell is happening? That night, Daniel barely moved from his couch. He had locked his bedroom door. He had shoved a chair under the handle. He wasn't taking any chances. But at 2:37 a.m., the pacing started again. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Back and forth. Right above him. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, gripping his blanket tightly. Then, tap, tap, tap. Daniel's breath hitched. The tapping wasn't coming from above this time. It was coming from the wall, right next to him. Daniel's whole body stiffened. And then, a voice. Low, slow, just barely above a whisper. It said, let me in. Daniel's blood ran cold. He shook his head violently, clamping a hand over his mouth. The voice was so close, just on the other side of the wall. It whispered again, let me in. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. His heart pounded so hard he thought it would burst. The voice hummed softly. Then in a slow, taunting whisper it said, I see you, Daniel. Daniel's stomach dropped. It knew his name. His whole body trembled. Then, silence. Daniel waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then hours. And nothing. When the sun finally rose, he let out a shaky breath. But he knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Here's the next part of The Neighbor Upstairs, continuing seamlessly. Daniel didn't sleep. Even as the morning light streamed through his window, his body refused to relax. His mind kept replaying the whisper, the way it had slithered through the wall, curling around his name like a promise. It knew him. It was watching. His hands shook as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't drink it, just stared into the dark liquid, his reflection warped in the surface. He muttered to himself, I need to get out of here. But he didn't move. Something in him knew leaving wouldn't fix this. The voice, the tapping, the footsteps. They would follow him. He had to understand it. He had to see. By afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in front of 302 again. The hallway was empty, silent. His heart pounded. He raised his fist, paused, then knocked. Softly. Once. Twice. The sound echoed. He held his breath. Then, a slow, deliberate creak. The door. It had moved. Not open. Not closed. Just barely ajar. Daniel's mouth went dry. He whispered, "Hello." No response. The air smelled stale. Dusty. Something tugged at him. A deep, primal warning. Leave. Run. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he raised a hand and, with the gentlest push, nudged the door open. The darkness inside swallowed him. Daniel took a slow step in. The air was thick. Heavy. He whispered, "Anyone here?" Silence. The apartment was almost identical to his own. Same layout. Same walls. But something was wrong. It was empty. No furniture. No decorations. Just bare walls and dust-covered floors. Except, Daniel's stomach clenched. There, in the farthest corner of the room, a single chair, facing the wall, and in front of it, a small battered hole, like someone had chipped away at the wall, bit by bit, carving into it over time. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. He took a slow step forward. The chair was old, its wood splintered, its seat worn down as if someone had sat there for hours, days, years, watching, through the hole. Daniel's breath came shallow. He followed the hole's angle. It faced directly into his apartment, right into his living room, right where he sat every night, right where he was when he heard the tapping. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. He whispered in horror, "No, no, no, no." Someone had been watching him. For how long? Days? Weeks? Years? His fingers curled into fists. He turned on his heel, ready to run. Then he saw it. A notebook, sitting on the floor beside the chair. Daniel hesitated. Then slowly he bent down and picked it up. The cover was thin, worn. He opened it. Inside, page after page, of his name, scrawled in frantic, desperate handwriting. Daniel, 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 over and over. Daniel's breath hitched. He flipped the pages, his heart hammering. More words. "I see you. I see you. I see you." Then, the last entry, scrawled in thick, uneven ink. "I am inside now." Daniel's stomach twisted. He turned and froze. The door to the apartment. It was closed, but he never closed it. And then, behind him, a whisper, low, close, right against his ear. It said, "I see you, Daniel." Daniel spun around, his body frozen in terror. The whisper was so close he could almost feel the breath on his skin. His eyes darted around the room, heart racing. The apartment was empty, completely empty, but the whisper lingered in his ears, like a ghost he couldn't shake. "I see you, Daniel." His hands trembled as he backed away toward the door. He had to get out. He had to leave. But then he heard something else. A slow scraping sound. It came from the wall. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like nails dragging across plaster. But it was there. Daniel's breath quickened. He couldn't look away from the wall. The scraping was louder now, sharper, more deliberate. Then, a voice. It wasn't the whisper anymore. It was clearer, familiar. "Let me in." Daniel's blood ran cold. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The scraping grew louder. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. And then, the wall split. A crack ran down the center, like the apartment itself was tearing open. Daniel staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. The crack grew, spreading out like a spider's web, the edges jagged and raw. From the split, something began to emerge. A hand, long, thin fingers that curled out from the wall like they were reaching for him. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, his legs paralyzed with fear. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The hand was pale, almost translucent, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. It slowly curled around the edge of the crack, like it was testing the air, feeling its way into the room. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder. "I'm here. I'm finally here." Daniel's body surged into motion. He turned and bolted for the door, his hand slamming against the doorknob. But it wouldn't open. It was locked. No. He turned back, and the hand had fully emerged from the wall now. It was attached to something. A figure, tall and possibly thin, its body twisted and elongated like it didn't belong in the same space as the rest of the world. The face was the worst part. A skull. Its features were contorted, stretched into a silent scream. Its eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness. The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came out. But Daniel heard it. He heard the same whisper he had been hearing all along. The same one that had been taunting him for days. "I see you, Daniel." The figure reached forward with its bony hand, its fingers curling into claws. Daniel's pulse raced as he finally managed to yank open the door. He didn't look back as he sprinted down the hallway, his breath ragged in his throat. The echo of the figure's footsteps, impossibly fast, followed him. He didn't stop running until he was back in his apartment, slamming the door behind him. He locked it. Then he backed away, his back pressed to the door. He was safe. For now. But even as Daniel stood there, trying to catch his breath, he knew it wasn't over. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there. In his head. Inside his walls. And somewhere, someone was still watching. The days that followed felt like a blur. Daniel barely slept. Every creak in the building, every echo in the hallways made his heart race. The whispers never stopped. He could feel them pressing against his skin, curling into his thoughts, tugging at the edges of his sanity. He tried to push it away, tried to convince himself it was just his mind unraveling, but deep down he knew the truth. The thing from upstairs wasn't just in his head. It was real, and it was getting closer. One night, Daniel sat in his living room, the lights dimmed low, his eyes scanning the corners of the room. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He knew he wasn't imagining it. Every time he looked up, he could almost see the shape of someone in the shadows. Then, a knock. At the door. Daniel's heart stopped. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky beneath him, and walked toward the door. His hand hovered over the knob. "Don't open it. Don't open it." But he had to. He had to know. His fingers gripped the handle, and with a steadying breath, he pulled the door open. There was no one there. Nothing but empty space in the hallway. Daniel exhaled in relief, but the sense of dread didn't leave. The air felt colder. His eyes flicked down to the floor, and there on the welcome mat was a small, crumpled note. He bent down to pick it up, his fingers trembling. It read, "I'm still watching." Daniel's stomach turned. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic. It looked like the same scrawl from the notebook in 302. The same thing had been watching him. He rushed to slam the door shut, but then, another knock. Louder. Urgent. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He backed away from the door, eyes wide. He couldn't breathe. The knocking grew frantic, almost desperate. And then, with a sudden crash, the door flew open, slamming against the wall. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. Tall, thin. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across its bones. Its eyes were wide, empty holes. And its mouth, it was twisted into a grotesque grin. Daniel's body froze. He couldn't move. The figure's head tilted to the side, as if studying him. Then in that familiar low voice it whispered, "I'm inside now." The room seemed to warp around him. The walls stretched. The shadows grew longer, darker, closing in on him. The air thickened with the scent of something rotten. Daniel staggered back, his body screaming to escape, but his legs wouldn't respond. His mind was caught in a vice grip of terror. The figure took a slow step forward, its eyes never leaving his. It reached out, slowly, deliberately, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat as its fingers brushed against his arm. Cold, cold as ice. The figure leaned in, its face inches from his. Its lips barely moved as it whispered again, "I've been here all along." And then it was gone. Daniel fell to his knees, gasping for air, his chest heaving. The room was silent now, as if the figure had never been there at all. He looked around, his mind spinning, trying to process what had just happened. But nothing made sense anymore. His whole life had become a nightmare. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in on him. He felt the weight of something, someone always there, lurking in the corners, watching. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here. But even as he made his way to the door, he knew it was too late. It was too late to escape. The whispers would follow him. The figure would follow him. Wherever he went, it would be there. The next morning, Daniel couldn't bring himself to leave the apartment. He stayed in his bed, staring at the ceiling, every small noise making him jump. The tapping on the walls, the creaks in the floorboards, they never stopped. They were always there, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of his hearing. And then, he heard something new. A voice. Soft but unmistakable. It said, "I'm sorry." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He sat up, his eyes wide, scanning the room. "I didn't mean to scare you," the voice said again. Daniel's pulse raced. He whispered, Who is this?" The voice chuckled softly, a low, dry sound. "It's me, the neighbor." Daniel's blood ran cold. He said, "What do you want?" There was a long pause, and then the voice whispered, too softly, too intimately, "I just want to watch." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Daniel could barely breathe. His mind was spinning, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was coming from inside the walls, from everywhere. It was impossible to escape. "I just want to watch." It echoed in his ears, a steady rhythm, repeating like a curse. Daniel scrambled off the bed, his eyes darting around the room. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the apartment. But as he reached for the door, his hands trembling, he heard the voice again. "Don't go. It's too late for that now." Daniel froze. The air grew colder. The whispers seemed to wrap around him, tightening with every passing second. He turned, his back pressed to the door. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His mind raced. There had to be something, anything. And then, through the haze of panic, one thought surfaced. The notebook. The one from the apartment upstairs. Maybe it held the answers. Daniel didn't hesitate. He bolted for the hallway, his feet pounding against the floor as he rushed toward the stairs. He could feel the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on him, the walls vibrating with a low hum of energy. Every step felt like an eternity. When he reached 302, his hand was shaking as he turned the doorknob. It creaked open just like before. The same stale, suffocating air filled his lungs as he stepped inside. The apartment was the same, empty, silent, but the chair was still there. And the notebook. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he moved toward it, his fingers trembling as he picked it up again. The pages were still filled with his name, scribbled over and over in frantic ink. But this time, something was different. There, on the final page, was a new entry. "I'm waiting for you." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Waiting? He turned the page, his mind reeling. Then, another entry. "I can't leave. Not yet. Not until I finish." His pulse quickened as he flipped to the next page. "You're a part of this now. We all are." Daniel felt the walls close in on him. He couldn't think, couldn't process what he was reading. "You're mine now." The words blurred in front of his eyes. The room seemed to shift. The edges of his vision warped, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still in 302, or if he had stepped into another world entirely. A world where the whispers were alive. A world where the thing upstairs had always been. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The temperature dropped so fast Daniel's breath came out in visible clouds. He felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Then, a noise. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but then it grew louder. The floor creaked under the weight of something heavy, something moving. Daniel turned toward the source of the sound, but the room was still empty. No one was there. The sound grew louder, closer. Then he saw it. The chair. It moved, slowly. At first, just a small shift, but then more. It scraped across the floor, inch by inch, until it was facing Daniel. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The chair sat there, empty in front of him. But the presence of it, the weight of it, was overwhelming. It felt like it was watching him, waiting for him. And then, a whisper so close, he could almost feel it against his skin. "You're ready now." Daniel's pulse raced. His knees went weak. He couldn't stop the tremor that ran through his body. He backed away, his feet shuffling across the floor, until he hit the wall behind him. He was trapped, and then he saw it. In the corner of the room, next to the window. A shape, faint at first, but slowly becoming more defined. A figure. Tall. Thin. It was standing perfectly still, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. It wasn't moving, but it felt like it was closing in on him, drawing him in. "You've been waiting for this," the voice murmured, its tone almost tender. "Just like I have." Daniel's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He had to get out. He had to. But the door was gone. The apartment had swallowed it. The walls were closing in, squeezing the life out of him, until there was nothing left but the thing from upstairs. It was inside him now, and the suffocating darkness that followed. He could feel the air thickening around him, the oppressive weight of it pressing down from all sides. The figure stepped forward, its long, pale fingers reaching out for him. "It's too late, Daniel," it whispered. And then the world went black. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was no longer in the apartment. The room was gone. The figure was gone. The walls that had pressed in on him, all gone. But there was a weight on his chest, a pressure that didn't belong. His breathing was shallow, uneven. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as if it were trapped beneath something thick and suffocating. He struggled, forcing himself to sit up, his head spinning. And then he saw it. He wasn't alone. The figure, the thing, was standing in front of him. It was different now. The tall, thin silhouette had taken on a new form, one that was no longer distorted by shadows. It was closer now, its twisted grin stretching wider, its hollow eyes boring into his very soul. The skin on its face seemed to stretch too tight, like it was pulling away from the skull beneath. Daniel recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't move. His limbs were like lead. The figure spoke again, but this time, the voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "I've been watching you for so long, Daniel. I've seen everything." The room around him flickered. No, the world around him flickered, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The walls were gone now, replaced by an endless void. Blackness stretched out in every direction. No windows, no doors, just darkness. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth moved, but the air was thick, like something was suffocating him from the inside. The figure leaned closer, its face just inches from his, and again it whispered, only this time the words were in his head, a voice he couldn't escape. "You're part of the story now. You always have been." Daniel shook his head, tears filling his eyes. He didn't understand. "No," he gasped. "No, please." The figure's grin widened. It wasn't smiling anymore. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. "You were always meant to be here." Daniel closed his eyes, squeezing them shut as tightly as he could. He could still feel the figure's gaze, its presence so overwhelming it was like the darkness was swallowing him whole. And then the whispers came again. "I see you. You can't hide. Not from me." It wasn't just one voice now. The room was filled with them, voices, hundreds, maybe thousands, all speaking at once. Their words were unintelligible, overlapping, a cacophony of madness that filled his ears and rattled his mind. "You're here. You're mine. You'll always be mine." He couldn't breathe. The words clawed at his sanity. each whisper tearing away at what was left of his mind. He wanted to scream. He wanted to escape. But all he could do was sit there, paralyzed, listening to the never-ending voices that circled around him. And then something changed. The figure's voice turned softer. "I told you, Daniel. I've been watching you for so long. You didn't realize, but you were always the one I was waiting for." Daniel opened his eyes, blinking in confusion. "What do you mean?" he whispered, though his voice barely made it out. The figure's face softened, the twisted grin fading into something almost sad. "I've waited for years. I've been here in this place watching, waiting, and I thought I was alone. But I wasn't. You were always meant to find me." Daniel's heart pounded. His vision was blurry, but the figure's words were somehow sinking in. He didn't understand, but there was a strange sense of recognition in its voice. The neighbor upstairs, the apartment 302. It wasn't just a coincidence. Daniel's stomach dropped. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. The whispers, the knocking, the chair moving, the journal. He was part of this. He had been pulled into this nightmare, whether he liked it or not. "Why me?" Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer right away. It simply stared at him, its empty eyes piercing his soul. Then finally it spoke again. "Because you were always meant to be here with me. You were always going to be the one who unlocked the door." Daniel's chest tightened as the weight of its words settled on him. He knew something was wrong. He knew that he hadn't just moved into a new apartment. He had walked into a trap, and now it was too late to escape. Daniel's mind swirled. The weight of the figure's words crushed down on him, suffocating him, until he could barely breathe. He tried to stand, tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. His limbs felt like they were glued to the floor. The darkness around him seemed to stretch endlessly, pressing in from all sides, and the whispers, they never stopped. "You're mine now, Daniel. There's no turning back." The figure's voice was almost soothing, like it was comforting him, even though every word sent a wave of panic crashing through his chest. "I didn't want this," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. His throat was tight, his words strangled. "I just wanted to live in peace. I didn't ask for any of this." The figure tilted its head, as if considering him. Its hollow eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to pulse with its every movement. "You never asked, but you were always a part of this. Always." Daniel's stomach churned, his mind racing for any way out. But the more he thought, the more he realized there was no escape. The apartment, the walls, the whispers, they were all connected. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice barely holding steady. The figure's grin returned, wider this time, stretching unnaturally across its face. There was a glimmer of something behind its empty eyes, something almost gleaming, like malice wrapped in sweetness. "I am the one who watches, the one who waits." Daniel's head spun as it spoke. The words felt like a curse, each one sinking into his mind, digging deep into the very core of his being. The shadows around him seemed to grow darker, the silence pressing in, only interrupted by the steady, growing hum of the whispers. "I've watched everyone, for years. No one sees me. No one knows I'm here." Daniel swallowed hard, fighting against the rising tide of terror threatening to drown him. "You've been here watching everyone? All this time?" The figure nodded slowly, its grin fading into something darker, more unsettling. "Yes, and now you will watch with me." Before Daniel could respond, the space around them began to shift. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like it was folding in on itself. He heard the unmistakable sound of creaking wood, then the faint murmur of footsteps coming from behind him. He spun around, but the apartment had changed again. The walls were no longer empty. They were now lined with photographs, old photographs, worn and faded. People he didn't recognize stared back at him, their expressions blank, their eyes hollow and empty. The floor creaked underfoot as the figure began to move, its presence drawing Daniel's attention back to it. With each step it took, the room around them seemed to bend and shift. It was as though they were trapped in a never-ending loop, a cycle of endless watching. "You see, Daniel," the figure said, its voice soft, almost affectionate now. "This is what it is. This is what I do. I watch. I wait. I collect." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Collect?" he repeated, his voice trembling. The figure nodded, its grin now a twisted mockery of something human. "Everyone who has come before you. The ones in the photos. They're part of me now. Just like you will be." Daniel staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment was closing in on him, the photos on the walls stretching, their eyes following his every movement. "What do you want from me?" Daniel demanded, his voice raw with desperation. "I don't want anything from you, Daniel," the figure said. "You've already given me everything I need. You've become part of my collection." The darkness around him seemed to pulse in time with the figure's words. The air felt thick, suffocating. Daniel could barely think. The weight of everything pressing in on him was too much to bear. "You were always meant to be here," the figure whispered, moving closer. "Now you will watch with me. Forever." Daniel felt the ground beneath him give way. His knees buckled, and he fell to the floor. The darkness swallowed him whole, consuming him entirely. And then, a shift. The whispers grew louder. The images on the walls, the photographs, started to blur and twist. Faces began to emerge from the shadows, people. But they weren't like him. They weren't alive. They were frozen. Trapped in the same nightmare. Daniel screamed, but no sound came out. The figure was right. He had become part of its collection. His life, his very soul, was now one with the others in the photographs. He was just another shadow, another forgotten face in a long line of victims. And the worst part, he realized too late that there were countless others, and they were all watching him. Daniel's mind felt as though it were breaking apart. Each thought was jagged, fragmented, like pieces of glass scattering across the floor. His body was still paralyzed, but his mind was racing, trying to make sense of the horror he was now trapped in. The photographs around him, those faces, those hollow eyes, they were real. They were like him, like everyone else who had ever stepped into this nightmare. The figure towered over him, its presence suffocating, blocking out everything else. Daniel tried to look away, but the eyes of the photographs followed him, their cold, lifeless stares drilling into him, silently accusing him. "You've seen too much now, Daniel. There's no going back," the figure said softly, almost tenderly. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. It was like the darkness had stolen his voice, stolen his ability to fight. "Do you understand?" the figure asked, its tone a twisted mixture of curiosity and amusement. Daniel nodded weakly, his throat tight with fear. He understood all too well now. He had walked into a trap, and now there was no way out. He was trapped in a web of madness, a place where time had no meaning, where the past and future were twisted together into one never-ending nightmare. And the worst part, the figure was right. He had been a part of it all along. "I've waited so long for someone like you," the figure continued, its voice so soft now it almost seemed gentle. "Someone who could see." The room around them flickered, like the very air was alive. Daniel could feel it, the strange, almost electrical hum that buzzed just beneath the surface of reality. The photographs on the walls shifted again, their faces distorting, their features warping into grotesque shapes. The voices in the room grew louder, overlapping, until they were nothing but a cacophony of whispers that reverberated through his skull. "Can you hear them?" the figure whispered, leaning down closer to him. "They're all here, Daniel, waiting." Daniel's eyes widened as the whispers intensified, becoming sharper, more insistent. He tried to block them out, but it was impossible. They were inside his head, swirling around him like a storm, demanding his attention. "Listen," the figure urged. They've all been waiting for you to hear them. Now you can't escape. Daniel clenched his fists, trying desperately to hold onto some shred of his sanity. He couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, win. He had to find a way out. But the longer he stayed, the more the room seemed to close in on him. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were all alive now, pulsing and shifting in ways that defied logic. "You'll join us, Daniel," the figure said, its voice no longer sweet but cold and commanding. "You'll join the others. You'll be one of us. Forever." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, a thought, a single desperate thought, flickered through his mind. He could fight back. Maybe there was something he could do. With trembling hands, he reached for the nearest photograph, the face of a woman whose eyes were wide with terror. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. As his fingers brushed the frame, something strange happened. The room shuddered. A low, growling noise echoed through the air, like the very walls were alive and angry. The figure hissed, its eyes narrowing. "You're trying to fight it. You can't. You will never escape." But Daniel wasn't listening. His fingers tightened around the photograph, pulling it free from the wall. The room seemed to shift, the floor beneath him trembling. For a brief moment, he felt like he was standing on solid ground, as if the very act of pulling the photograph had caused the world to snap back into place. And then the figure lunged. It was fast, too fast. Before Daniel could react, the thing was on top of him, its cold fingers wrapping around his throat. Its grip was like iron, choking the air from his lungs. The room around them seemed to twist violently, as if the darkness itself was closing in. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices screaming in a language Daniel couldn't understand. But even in the midst of the pain, Daniel's mind was working. He couldn't think of a way out, but he could think of a way to distract it. His free hand shot out, grabbing at the pile of photographs on the ground. He didn't know why, but something told him it was important. With all the strength he could muster, he hurled the photographs at the figure. The instant they made contact, the world around them snapped. The figure screeched, a horrible, shrill sound that reverberated through the air, shaking the very walls. Daniel felt his body slammed against the floor as the room around them dissolved into blackness. And then, just like that, everything was still. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Daniel could still feel the coldness in the air, the weight of the figure's presence lingering, but it was gone. The room had returned to normal, or what passed for normal. The photographs were gone. The whispers were gone. And yet, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, watching him from somewhere just beyond the edge of his vision. He was alone. For now. But for how long? And then a thought crossed his mind, a horrifying realization. It wasn't over. The figure might have been gone for now, but he was still in the apartment. He was still trapped. And this time there was no escape. Daniel lay on the floor, his body aching, the air thick with tension. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He had fought back. He had done something that seemed to have made the figure vanish, but he knew deep down that the battle wasn't over. The silence in the room was unnerving. It felt like the calm before a storm, a brief, deceptive pause. The walls of the apartment felt too close, too suffocating. It was as if they were watching him now, waiting for him to make his next move. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His breath was shallow, his heart thundering in his chest. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of the figure, any hint that it was still there. But everything seemed normal. The apartment looked unchanged, untouched. The furniture sat where it had always been. The kitchen was silent, the living room as empty as it had been before. It was the same place he had moved into weeks ago, the same place he thought would offer him peace and solitude. But it wasn't. There was something wrong with this place, something deeply wrong. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, that it had always been this way. The figure, the photographs, the whispers, they were just the beginning. A sudden sound made Daniel jump, a creak from above, the floorboards in the ceiling, the apartment above. His heart skipped a beat. He could feel the blood drain from his face as the memories flooded back. The noises he had heard late at night, the strange scuttling, the scratching. It had all been leading to this moment, hadn't it? Without thinking, Daniel's feet moved. He had to confront it. He had to find the source of the noise. Maybe, just maybe, if he faced it head-on, he could finally break free from whatever curse was haunting him. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he moved toward the stairs that led to the apartment above. With each step, he felt a coldness seep into his bones, a chill that gnawed at his very soul. The whispers, they hadn't stopped. They were still there, faint but persistent, always just out of reach, like a murmur from another world. When Daniel reached the door to the apartment above, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the metal cold beneath his fingers. The air around him seemed to thicken, the weight of something unseen pressing against him. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, like voices trapped in the walls, trying to claw their way out. He turned the knob. The door creaked open with a groan, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence of the hallway. Inside, the apartment was dark. The blinds were drawn tightly, casting everything in an eerie dim light. Dust particles floated in the air, visible in the thin beams of light that managed to seep through the cracks. Daniel stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The floor was covered with discarded furniture, old clothes, and piles of forgotten belongings. But there was no one here. No sign of life. No sign of the figure. The room felt empty, but in a way that made Daniel's skin crawl. It was as if the very air had been hollowed out, leaving behind a vacuum of nothingness. He stepped further into the apartment, the floor creaking beneath his feet. The whispers had become more insistent now, almost like a chant, repeating over and over, over and over. Daniel moved toward the back of the apartment, where a door led into what appeared to be a small bedroom. It was the only room that had any sign of life. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and torn, as if someone had been in a hurry to leave, or perhaps had been pulled away. In the center of the room stood a large, full-length mirror. It was old, the frame ornate and chipped with age, but it caught Daniel's attention immediately. There was something about it, a sense of foreboding, like it was alive, staring back at him. He couldn't help it. He walked toward it. The closer he got, the more the whispers grew. They surrounded him, swirling around his head like a cloud of insects, filling his ears with maddening noise. He tried to block them out, but they pushed through, sharp and biting, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. When he stood in front of the mirror, he froze. The reflection was wrong. At first, he didn't see it. The room behind him looked normal, dark, cluttered, just as it should. But then, he saw movement in the corner of the reflection. It was faint at first, just a flicker in the corner of his eye. But then it grew clearer. A figure, a shape, the same figure from the apartment below. It stood just behind him, its hollow eyes watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was grinning again, that same twisted smile, its mouth stretched far too wide. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Just the same dark corners, the same silence. He turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Gone. The reflection was normal again. But Daniel knew. He knew what he had seen. "You can't escape me," the voice whispered, now clear as day. The figure's voice, its cold, mocking tone, cut through the silence. "You're already mine, Daniel." The room seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing, the air thickening. The whispers had become a roar now, deafening, drowning out everything else. He felt his legs give way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, clutching his head in an attempt to block out the noise. The figure's laughter echoed in his mind, twisting around him like a noose, pulling him deeper into the madness. He tried to scream, but his throat was raw, his voice lost in the torrent of sound. "Welcome to my world, Daniel," the figure's voice whispered, right in his ear. "You'll never leave." And as the darkness closed in around him, Daniel realized with a sickening certainty, he was never meant to escape. Daniel's body trembled as the darkness around him thickened. His mind was on the edge of breaking, the sound of the figure's laughter pounding against his skull, echoing through the room. His hands were pressed to his ears, as though trying to block out the noise, but it was futile. The voices, so many voices, were inside him now, clawing at his consciousness. "You can't fight it," the figure taunted, its voice coming from every direction. "You've been part of this all along. The photographs, the whispers, the noises, you're just another piece of the puzzle." Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to push himself up from the floor. His legs felt like jelly, and the weight of the air pressing down on him made it almost impossible to move. But he had to escape. There had to be a way out. With a final burst of energy, Daniel forced himself to his feet. The room spun around him, but he kept moving, stumbling toward the door. The whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic, as though the walls themselves were closing in, eager to swallow him whole. "You can't leave." The figure's voice was louder now, more desperate. "You belong here, Daniel. You were always meant to stay." But Daniel refused to listen. He couldn't. Not anymore. He had to escape, had to get out of this cursed place before it consumed him completely. As his hand gripped the doorknob, the whispers fell silent for a split second, only to be replaced by a different sound. A soft, creaking noise coming from above. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. It was the sound of footsteps. The footsteps of someone or something moving above him. The same sound he had heard so many nights before. The same noise that had brought him here in the first place. The figure was still with him, still watching him from the shadows. It was everywhere. It always had been. Daniel couldn't fight it anymore. He opened the door. The apartment outside was dark, silent. The hallway stretched before him, long and empty, but the air felt different. The temperature had dropped. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe along the walls, like dark tendrils reaching out to pull him back. But Daniel kept moving, his feet dragging as he made his way down the hallway. He was nearing the exit, the front door of the building just ahead. It should have been a sign of freedom. But then he stopped. A sound, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come back." The voice was familiar, cold and harsh. It sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He turned around. There, standing in the hallway behind him, was the figure. It was smiling, the same wide, twisted grin. Its eyes, those hollow eyes, were locked onto his, as if it had been waiting for him all along. "You can't escape, Daniel," the figure whispered, its voice now calm, almost soothing. "You belong to me. You always have." Daniel wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The weight of the figure's presence was suffocating, like it had wrapped its fingers around his very soul. It was then that he realized the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. The apartment wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a trap, and Daniel had been walking toward his doom since the moment he'd moved in. "You're part of the family now," the figure continued, its voice almost affectionate. "Just like all the others before you." Daniel's vision blurred. The room seemed to stretch and warp, the shadows flickering in the corners of his eyes. He could feel himself slipping, his mind unraveling as the darkness closed in. "Welcome home, Daniel," the figure whispered, its smile widening until it seemed to consume everything. And then, everything went dark. When Daniel awoke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to fill the space around him. It was thick, like a blanket wrapped around him, stifling his every breath. He wasn't sure how long he had been unconscious. Time had lost all meaning here. All he knew was that he was no longer in the hallway, no longer standing in the place where the figure had cornered him. He was back in the apartment, the one he had moved into. But it didn't feel like the same apartment anymore. The walls were darker, the shadows deeper. The air was cold, colder than he had ever felt it before. There were no sounds now, no whispers, no footsteps from above, only the deafening quiet. Daniel sat up slowly, his head spinning. He looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The furniture was the same, old, worn, and covered in dust. The curtains were drawn, just as they had been before. But something was wrong. The space felt different. It felt alive. His eyes landed on the wall across from him. The same wall he had looked at countless times before. The same place where he had seen the photographs, the eerie images of the previous tenants. But now the photos were different. They were new. There were more of them now. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, scattered across the walls in a chaotic collage. Faces he didn't recognize stared out at him, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Some of the photographs were distorted, warped, as though the figures in them were changing. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He stood up shakily, his legs barely able to support his weight as he stumbled toward the wall. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over one of the photos. A woman's face. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. He didn't recognize her, but there was something about the photo that felt familiar, something that gnawed at him, deep in his chest. He moved his hand to another photo, then another. Each one was the same, a person trapped in a moment of terror, their eyes wide with fear. And then he saw it. In the corner of one of the photos, hidden behind a figure, was a face he knew. His own. Daniel froze, his blood turning to ice as he stared at the image. It was a photo of him, but it wasn't him. His face was twisted in fear, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a scream. But the image wasn't from any time he remembered. This photo was of him now. He backed away, his chest tight with panic. The air around him grew colder still, as if the apartment was drawing the life out of him. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows reaching out to pull him in. And then he heard it, the faintest of sounds. A whisper. "You're one of us now, Daniel." It came from behind him. Slowly he turned. Standing in the doorway of the room was the figure. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Daniel could feel its eyes on him. The grin was there, stretching wider than ever, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. "Welcome home," the figure said, its voice echoing in the silence. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen, trapped in the apartment, trapped in the walls that seemed to have swallowed him whole. The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating, its form growing larger as it approached. Daniel could feel it, the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It smiled, that wide, terrifying smile. "You're just like the others," it whispered. "You always were." And with that, the world around Daniel faded. Daniel's vision blurred, the edges of the room warping, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling before him. His mind screamed, trying to hold on to something, anything, to anchor him to this world. But the more he struggled, the further away everything seemed to drift. The figure's voice, the one that had haunted him from the beginning, was all he could hear now. Its laughter, the mocking tone, the whispering that filled his head like a flood of cold water. "You were always meant to be here." The words circled in his mind, twisting like a snake. "You never left. You've always been one of us." With a final, overwhelming pull, everything snapped. Daniel's world went dark. The apartment, the hallway, the mirror, the figure, everything faded away into nothingness. There was no longer any sound. No whispers. No laughter. No presence. Only silence, empty and vast. And then slowly a light began to form. A faint, distant glow that flickered like a dying flame. Daniel's eyes blinked open. He was back in the same apartment, the same space that had once felt like a prison, but now it was different. There were no shadows, no twisted walls. Everything was calm, still, For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a strange peace wash over him. His breathing was steady, his heart no longer pounding in his chest. The photographs on the walls were gone. The whispers were silent. The figure had vanished. It was over. But as Daniel took in the room, as he began to breathe again, something was missing. The warmth, the comfort, the sense of being alive, it was gone. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the place he had once called home. It no longer felt like a home. It was just a shell, a hollow, empty space. A soft sound caught his attention. A creak, a step, from above. The footsteps, the sounds, the familiar presence. Daniel's stomach lurched as his heart froze. His gaze snapped upward, staring at the ceiling, feeling the same cold presence that had haunted him for weeks. He wasn't alone. The whispering started again, soft at first, then louder. It was unmistakable now, his name. Over and over. Daniel. The sound echoed through the apartment, reverberating off the walls. And then, as if it had always been waiting, the door to the apartment above creaked open. The light from inside spilled into the hallway, flickering like a dying candle. But Daniel didn't move. He didn't run. He couldn't. The figure stepped into the doorway, its form indistinct, yet unmistakably there. The smile was wide, stretching impossibly, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You're home," it whispered. And with those final words, Daniel understood. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. He was part of this place now. Forever. Name of the next story, The Late Night Shift. Marcus had never minded the quiet. In fact, he liked it. The stillness that came with the night shift at the office building was a welcome change from the chaos of the day. He'd been working as a security guard for 3 months now, and by all accounts, it was the perfect job. The building was empty by the time the clock hit 7 p.m., with only him and a few security cameras keeping watch over the rows of silent desks and empty hallways. Every night, he'd take his rounds, checking the locked doors and monitoring the security feeds from the small security booth on the ground floor. The job didn't require much effort, just a few hours of walking the perimeter and making sure nothing was out of place. The office building had a certain charm to it during these late hours, like it was frozen in time. A place that had seen endless days of work, but now it was abandoned. He usually settled in for the night with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a small stack of paperwork. His eyes would wander from time to time to the screens that displayed the various rooms of the building. On some nights, he would notice strange shadows moving across the cameras, fleeting glimpses of something that shouldn't be there. At first, he chalked it up to the cameras themselves. Maybe a glitch, a malfunction in the system. It wasn't unusual for security cameras to have their quirks. But after a few weeks of seeing these strange figures, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. One night, as the clock struck 2 a.m., he was reviewing the camera feeds, flicking from one room to another, when something caught his eye. In the far corner of the 4th floor camera, a shadow moved across the screen. It wasn't a typical shadow. This one was darker, more defined. And it moved with an eerie purpose, slinking along the edge of the office like a person trying to avoid detection. Marcus froze, his fingers hovering over the mouse as he replayed the footage. The shadow was gone in a blink. He checked the time, 2:03 a.m. There had been no reports of anyone in the building, no cleaners or maintenance crews scheduled at this hour. His heart began to race. He rubbed his eyes, unsure if the tiredness was messing with his vision. He zoomed in, staring at the blank office on the screen, but there was nothing there now. Maybe it was just his imagination, he thought. He had been working long hours and had hardly slept the night before. But as he turned back to the screen, a cold chill ran down his spine. The figure had returned. This time, it was closer, standing in the middle of the hallway, right beneath the camera. Marcus swallowed hard, trying to remain calm. He checked the other cameras quickly, but they all showed empty hallways and dark rooms. His eyes flicked back to the fourth floor. The shadow moved again, but this time it was more than just a blur. It was clearer, as if it had taken shape, its form solidifying as it stood still, facing the camera. The longer Marcus stared, the more details he could make out. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its outline was jagged, like a distorted figure wearing tattered clothes. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the edges of his chair. His thoughts raced. Was someone in the building? Was there a person hiding in the offices? But that didn't explain why the figure wasn't moving, why it was just standing there. Before he could react, the figure vanished, fading away like smoke dissipating in the night. Marcus blinked, his pulse quickening. He looked around the booth, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the security equipment. He quickly checked the other cameras again, but nothing. The fourth floor was empty. It was like nothing had happened. His mind told him to dismiss it. Just a glitch, just tired eyes playing tricks on him. But deep down, a cold sense of unease settled into his gut. He tried to shake it off and continued his rounds, walking through the hallways, checking each floor. He went to the fourth floor last, just to make sure everything was fine. The lights flickered overhead as he stepped onto the deserted floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. The silence felt different now. Heavy. He glanced around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Nothing was out of place. Everything looked the same as it always did. But when he reached the hallway, the air felt off. There was an unnatural stillness. The walls seemed closer somehow, as if the space had shrunk since the last time he was there. He looked up at the security camera mounted on the corner of the ceiling. For a split second, he thought he saw movement in the reflection of the glass. He whipped his head around, but again the hallway was empty. No shadow, no figure. Still, his heart pounded in his chest. He continued his walk through the office, his flashlight sweeping over desks and chairs. He checked the doors one by one. Everything was secure, just as it should be. And yet, as he turned to leave the floor, something stopped him in his tracks. There, at the far end of the hallway, a door was slightly ajar. He had checked that door earlier. It was locked. But now it was open, just a crack. The dim light from the hallway illuminated the edge of the door, casting a faint shadow inside. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His breath caught in his throat. He knew something wasn't right. The building was empty. He had checked every room. There was no one else in the building. But that door, he had definitely locked it. With cautious steps, Marcus moved toward the door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he approached, the shadows seemed to shift, making the hallway feel longer, the space more oppressive. He reached the door and hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle, his heartbeat thudding in his chest. Was it just his nerves playing tricks on him? He pushed the door open slowly. The room inside was pitch black, but the faint glow of the exit sign illuminated the edge of the far wall. He stepped inside, the sound of his shoes squeaking against the floor breaking the silence. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, his pulse racing. No one was there, but as he turned to leave, a cold gust of air brushed past him. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that made him jump. He spun around, his flashlight falling to the floor with a dull thud. The room was now completely dark. All he could hear was the deafening silence. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. The same shadow, tall, distorted, and impossibly still. "Who's there?" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking in the silence. But the figure didn't respond. It only moved closer, its form becoming clearer. Its face was hidden, but he could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. Marcus backed away, his hands fumbling for the door handle, but it was no use. The door wouldn't open. The figure was getting closer. His breath came in shallow gasps. He needed to get out. But the room seemed to stretch, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Just as the figure was inches away, Marcus finally broke free, slamming against the door with all his strength. It swung open, and he bolted into the hallway. He didn't stop running until he reached the security booth. The cameras were all still running, but there was no sign of the figure. No shadow, no movement. He checked the monitors again, but everything was normal. But Marcus knew what he had seen. He knew what was out there, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows came again. Marcus spent the next few hours in the security booth, trying to calm his racing heart. His hands were still shaking, and his mind refused to let go of the image of that shadowy figure. He couldn't understand it. He'd worked countless night shifts before. He was used to the silence, the eerie stillness of an empty building. But this was different. This was something he couldn't explain, something he couldn't escape. He checked the time. It was nearing 4:30 a.m. The hours felt longer now, stretching out endlessly. The building around him was so quiet it felt unnatural, like the entire world outside had been frozen in place. The hum of the security monitors was the only sound, a constant reminder that he was alone in this vast, empty space. His eyes kept darting to the screens, unable to stop himself. There had been no more signs of the figure after he ran back to the booth, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, something watching him, waiting. The door to the security booth was locked. He had checked it when he sat down. It was always locked, but tonight, that simple fact felt like the thinnest barrier between him and whatever was out there. Another half hour passed, and Marcus forced himself to stand up. He couldn't stay in the booth forever. He had to keep moving, keep checking the cameras. He needed to convince himself that everything was fine, that it was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the system. But as he made his way down the hall toward the elevator, a strange sensation washed over him. The feeling that he was being watched, this time, it wasn't just in his mind. It was physical, as if the air itself had thickened around him. He stopped in his tracks. Something was wrong. Looking up, he noticed that one of the security cameras was pointing in the wrong direction. The camera on the 5th floor. It was supposed to be facing the stairwell, the main hallway. But now it was turned to face a corner of the office, a section of the building that he hadn't even passed by. He frowned. Had he missed something when he checked the monitors earlier? Was this just another malfunction? He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't let fear control him. He'd checked every other camera. Maybe this was just another glitch. A weird one, but still just a glitch. He took the elevator up to the 5th floor. The building seemed even quieter now. The silence pressed in on him from all sides, making the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. As the elevator doors slid open, a cold draft rushed past him. It was a chill that had no right to be there in the middle of a warm night. Marcus stepped into the hallway, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The floor was completely still. No sounds, no signs of life. But the more he walked down the hall, the more that feeling of being watched crept up on him again. His eyes kept flicking to the corners of the hallway, to the places where the shadows seemed to gather. But each time, the hallway was empty, just dark and still and wrong. He stopped in front of the office that the camera had been facing. The door was ajar, just like the one he had found earlier. He could feel his heart rate pick up again as he pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the office was empty, just like the last time. The dim light from the street outside filtered in through the blinds, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. The desk was tidy, untouched. The chairs were pushed in. Nothing had changed. But then he saw it. On the desk, just beside the keyboard, was something he hadn't noticed before. A piece of paper, a note, scribbled with jagged handwriting. He picked it up, his hands trembling as he read the message. "You're not alone." The words were clear, the ink smeared in places as if written hastily. His throat tightened. There was no mistaking it. This was no prank. This was something else. Something far worse. Before he could think, the door slammed shut behind him, rattling on its hinges. He spun around, panic rising in his chest. The room was still empty, but the air had changed. The temperature had dropped, and with it, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. A faint rustling came from the corner of the office. Marcus froze, his blood running cold. Slowly, he turned toward the sound. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was tall, too tall. Its outline was blurry, like it was made of shadows that refused to stay in one place. But the most terrifying thing of all was its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. They weren't human. They were cold, lifeless, and they locked onto Marcus with a predatory gaze. Marcus opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, suffocating. His feet were rooted to the floor, his body frozen in place as the figure moved toward him, gliding effortlessly across the room like it didn't even touch the ground. The shadows around it twisted and writhed, as if trying to pull him in. With each step the figure took, the air grew heavier, colder. It was like it was pulling the very warmth out of the room. Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears. He had to move. He had to get out, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure stopped in front of him, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it just stared at him, its eyes glowing brighter, filling his entire vision. He couldn't look away. The darkness around it seemed to consume everything, drawing him in, suffocating him. And then, in a voice that was both distant and close, the figure whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." Marcus finally snapped out of his trance, his instincts kicking in. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, slamming into the door with his shoulder. The door rattled but didn't open. His heart was in his throat as he slammed into it again. Finally, with a sickening creak, the door gave way, and he bolted into the hallway. But as he ran down the corridor, something made him look back. The figure was gone, but the air was thick with the scent of decay. A smell so foul it made him gag. He didn't stop. He couldn't. His legs burned as he sprinted toward the elevator, the echo of his footsteps filling the hallway. The elevator doors were closed, but as he approached, they opened by themselves. Marcus didn't question it. He dove inside and pressed the ground floor button, his fingers slipping on the panel as he tried to make it close faster. The elevator began its descent, the lights flickering overhead. The soft hum of the machinery was the only sound in the darkness. But even as the elevator moved, Marcus could feel it. The figure wasn't gone. It was still out there watching him, and it was only a matter of time before it came for him again. The elevator jolted to a stop. For a brief moment, Marcus was too stunned to react. The quiet hum of the elevator's machinery had stopped entirely, and the soft flickering of the lights above was replaced by a complete, suffocating darkness. The kind of darkness that felt alive, pressing against the very air he breathed. He felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, his heart hammering so loudly in his chest it almost drowned out the silence. The doors didn't open. They remained shut, as if the elevator had decided to trap him. His pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He pressed the emergency button repeatedly, but there was no response. The familiar sound of the elevator's bell did not ring. Panic began to gnaw at him from the edges of his mind. He felt the walls of the elevator closing in, suffocating him with an unseen presence. It was there, waiting. He could feel it just beyond the walls, breathing down his neck, watching. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails running along metal. Slowly at first, then louder, closer. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He whipped his head to the side, his eyes frantically scanning the dark corners of the elevator. There was no way out, no way to escape. His heart was in his throat now. Sweat streamed down his face as his fingers grasped the sides of the elevator walls, desperate to feel anything familiar. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there wanted him to hear it. It came from just outside the elevator doors. Then, to his horror, a soft whisper, barely audible, floated through the crack between the doors. "It's coming. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Marcus tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, something that made sense, but nothing came to him. The figure had followed him, he was sure of it. It wasn't just in the building, it was inside him now. He could feel it. And then, just as suddenly as the sensation began, it stopped. The scraping stopped. The whisper stopped. The darkness felt still. The elevator was as it had always been, quiet, motionless, waiting. Marcus stood there, frozen, for what seemed like hours. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to escape, to run, but he couldn't. His body betrayed him, paralyzed by a fear he couldn't name. He pressed the emergency button again. This time, the elevator jolted back to life. The lights flickered back on, the hum of the machinery returned, and the elevator doors opened with a soft ding. But it wasn't the ground floor he'd expected to see. It wasn't even the next floor down. It was the 5th floor, the very floor he had just fled from. His breath caught in his throat, and a cold chill crawled up his spine. This wasn't possible. The elevator couldn't have skipped floors. He had to get out of here. He had to leave. But the elevator doors were already sliding open. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He took a hesitant step out of the elevator, his eyes darting nervously to the empty hallway. It was silent again, too silent. The air smelled wrong, like something had been rotting in the walls. Then a movement, a shadow. It passed by just outside his line of sight, so quick that Marcus almost thought it was his imagination. Almost. But the shadows grew darker, thicker, coiling around the edges of the hallway like living things. They seemed to move with purpose, closing in, pushing him toward the center of the hallway. He couldn't look away. His eyes were glued to the spot where the shadow had passed, and with each second that ticked by, the darkness seemed to grow stronger, closer, as if it were feeding on his fear. A low, guttural whisper echoed from the end of the hallway. "Come closer." His body trembled, but his feet wouldn't move. Something about that voice paralyzed him, held him in place, rooted to the floor. The words were familiar. He had heard them before, in his dreams, when he was a child. But it wasn't a dream now. He knew that for sure. The shadows began to shift, and from the darkness, the figure emerged once more. It stepped into the faint light from the flickering overhead lamps. It was the same shape, the same tall, shadowy presence, but this time its form was clearer. The darkness seemed to peel back, revealing what lay beneath. A face, but not a face like any human's. It was distorted, stretched, like it was trying to mimic something human but couldn't quite get it right. Its eyes were wide, too wide, gleaming with an unnatural hunger. Its mouth was nothing more than a thin slit, stretched impossibly wide, exposing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. "You shouldn't have stayed," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind as much as in the hallway. Marcus stumbled back, his chest tightening as the air around him grew thicker, colder. He wanted to scream, but his voice failed him. He could feel the figure moving toward him, its form flickering in and out like it didn't belong in this world. The shadows reached out for him, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him toward the figure. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. There had to be something. The elevator, the stairwell, anything. But the more he thought, the more the shadows seemed to close in. The figure reached out with long, twisted fingers, and Marcus finally broke free of his paralysis. With one last burst of adrenaline, he turned and ran. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the figure's heavy footsteps following him, growing louder with every second. His breath was ragged, his legs burning, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The stairwell. He had to make it to the stairwell. He was almost there when the door to the stairwell slammed shut. He skidded to a stop, his heart leaping into his throat. He slammed his palm against the door, but it didn't budge. Locked. He turned to face the hallway. The figure was there. It was standing at the end, watching him with those wide, glowing eyes. And then, in a voice as cold as the grave, it said, "It's too late." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The air felt thick, suffocating. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure advanced. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to twist and writhe, following its movements. His mind screamed at him to run, to do anything, but his legs wouldn't obey. His whole body was paralyzed with fear, as if the darkness itself had seeped into his bones. The figure moved closer, its form flickering in and out like a broken signal. Its twisted face was now inches away from him, its cold breath like a wet gust of wind brushing against his skin. Marcus could see its mouth stretching wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. He felt as if the very essence of the thing was pulling at him, sucking the life out of him. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't have come here. You belong to us now." The shadows grew thicker, more oppressive. The walls around him seemed to close in, narrowing with each passing second. The floor beneath him felt soft, like it was sinking into something dark and endless. He could feel the presence of other figures now, moving just beyond the reach of his vision, their cold eyes watching him, waiting for their turn. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, constricted, as if something was choking him from the inside. His head spun and his legs gave way. He collapsed to the floor, his back hitting the cold, hard surface. He could feel the darkness creeping up his spine, reaching for him with icy fingers. With all the strength he could muster, Marcus forced himself to his feet, his knees shaking beneath him. He needed to get out. There had to be a way. His hands fumbled desperately for the door handle, but it was still locked. He banged on the door, his knuckles aching from the force of his strikes. "Help!" he shouted, though he knew it was useless. There was no one left, no one to hear him. But then something strange happened. As his fists pounded against the door, he heard something on the other side, something that sounded like footsteps. Real footsteps. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. Were they real? Or was his mind playing tricks on him? The door rattled. Marcus held his breath, his hand hovering over the handle. Then, with a loud click, the door swung open. On the other side stood someone he didn't recognize, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her hair wild and unkempt, her face pale and gaunt. She looked at him with wide, empty eyes, her lips trembling as if she was fighting to speak. But no words came out. The shadows behind Marcus seemed to recoil at the sight of her. The figure in the hallway froze, its grotesque face contorting in rage. It screeched, a sound that made Marcus's blood run cold. "No!" the figure howled, its voice a banshee's wail. "She can't be here. She's not supposed to be here." The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Marcus with a strange intensity. She reached out a hand, her fingers cold and pale, and placed them gently on his arm. In an instant, the world seemed to shift. The darkness that had consumed the hallway melted away, the shadows receding into nothingness. The air became lighter, the oppressive weight lifting from his chest. Marcus blinked, his surroundings clearing before his eyes. The woman was gone. The hallway was empty, no sign of the figure or the shadows that had once surrounded him. It was as if everything had returned to normal. But Marcus knew it wasn't normal. He knew that something had changed. His heart was still racing, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He looked around, disoriented. The stairwell door was open, and he could hear the faint hum of the elevator in the distance. He had to get out. He had to leave. He bolted for the stairwell, his legs still trembling beneath him. As he passed the elevator, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the shadowy figure to appear again. But there was nothing. The hall was eerily silent, too silent. It felt wrong, like a dream that he couldn't wake up from. The stairwell was quiet as well, the steps echoing in the stillness as he descended. He reached the ground floor in what felt like an eternity, his legs barely able to carry him. He pushed open the door and stumbled out into the lobby, where the harsh fluorescent lights flickered above him. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. He was outside, in the safety of the building's entrance. But even as he stood there, trying to collect himself, he felt something nagging at the back of his mind. He wasn't alone. There was something still with him. He couldn't shake the feeling. Turning, he scanned the lobby. It was empty. Completely empty. The building felt abandoned, almost like no one had been there for years. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and methodical, its hands creeping toward midnight. He felt a chill run down his spine. And then, just as he turned to leave, he heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, drifting through the empty hall. It was the same whisper he had heard earlier, in the darkness of the hallway. "It's not over." Marcus froze, his hand still on the door handle. He turned slowly, looking over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. The lobby was still, quiet, lifeless. But he knew. He knew it wasn't over. Name of the next story: The Lost Dog. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the Johnsons noticed their dog, Buster, was missing. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood as Sarah stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the yard. Her coffee cup, now forgotten on the counter, was starting to cool. "Buster?" she called softly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. She looked again, scanning the yard, but there was no sign of him. He was always there, trotting around, wagging his tail or barking at the birds in the trees. But today, nothing. She felt a sinking feeling in her chest. Maybe he had wandered off. Buster wasn't a young dog anymore, but he was never the type to stray too far. Sarah hurried to the door, stepping outside and calling his name louder now. "Buster!" She cupped her hands around her mouth, looking toward the neighbor's yard, the street, the wooded area behind their house. Still, there was nothing. Sarah's husband, Tom, had already gone to work, but she quickly grabbed her phone, texting him. "Have you seen Buster? He's not in the yard." She hit send and waited, but as minutes passed, her worry deepened. The dog never strayed far. He'd always return by now. She walked around the yard, checking the fences and the small shed in the corner where Buster sometimes liked to hide when it rained. Still no sign of him. That afternoon, Sarah posted flyers around the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen the dog. She even included a picture of Buster, his big, friendly eyes and black and white coat, wagging his tail in the photo. She hoped it was just a simple mistake, that Buster had wandered off to explore and would return soon. But as the days stretched into a week, Sarah began to fear the worst. Tom's efforts were equally as fruitless. They called animal shelters, posted on social media, and spoke to neighbors, but no one had seen their dog. It was as though Buster had disappeared into thin air. One evening, just as Sarah was sitting down to dinner with their two kids, Lucas and Emma, there was a knock at the door. Sarah stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Who could that be?" she murmured to herself, opening the door. Standing on the other side was a man Sarah didn't recognize. He was tall, with messy brown hair and a look of exhaustion in his eyes. In his arms, he cradled a dog, her dog. "Buster?" Sarah's voice broke as she took a step forward. The dog in the man's arms looked just like him, but there was something off. The familiar black and white fur, the long ears, the sad eyes. It was Buster, but... "Is this your dog?" the man asked. His voice was low, almost too quiet, like he wasn't sure if he should speak. His gaze lingered on the dog, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Yes, that's Buster," Sarah exclaimed, her voice shaky with relief. She stepped forward and reached out, but as soon as her hand brushed the dog's fur, a chill ran through her. Buster had never felt like this. His coat, usually soft and thick, felt coarse like straw, and his eyes, they weren't quite the same. They were dull, lacking the usual warmth and affection that Buster always showed. "Where did you find him?" Sarah asked, trying to hide the unease creeping into her voice. She was so grateful to have him back, but something about the situation didn't sit right. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I found him a few streets over," he said. "He seemed like he was wandering alone. I didn't want to leave him out there." "Oh, thank you," Sarah said quickly. "You have no idea how much this means to us. We've been looking for him everywhere." The man nodded, but there was still something strange about the way he looked at Buster. He seemed almost distant, like he didn't really care about the reunion. It unsettled Sarah, but she pushed the thought aside. She was just so happy to have her dog back. "Thank you," she repeated, reaching to take the dog from him. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously to the ground. "Just be careful with him," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "He's not the same." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, confused. The man shook his head and backed away slowly, his hand lifting in a strange half-wave. "I don't know. I just thought you should know. Take care of him," he muttered, then turned and walked down the driveway without another word. Sarah stood there for a moment, staring after him. His words hung in the air like an unsettling echo. He's not the same, but Buster was home, and that was all that mattered. She turned back into the house, carrying the dog inside. Once she set Buster down on the floor, Sarah tried to dismiss the odd feeling lingering in her chest. Her children ran up, excited to see their dog again, but even they hesitated when they looked at him. "Mom," Lucas said slowly, "is that really Buster?" "Yes, of course it is," Sarah replied, kneeling beside him. But as she met Lucas's gaze, she noticed his uncertainty, the way his small hands clenched into fists. "Why wouldn't it be?" "I don't know." Lucas trailed off, eyeing the dog, who was sitting quietly in the corner, staring at them with his odd, distant gaze. His tail didn't wag like it used to. He didn't seem happy to be home. Emma, who had always been especially close to Buster, was the first to break the silence. "He looks different." "Different?" Sarah asked, but the words felt hollow as they left her mouth. She leaned closer to the dog, brushing a hand over his coat. It didn't feel right, like a weight had settled on her chest. Before she could say anything else, Buster let out a low growl, the sound deep in his throat. It startled her, and she quickly pulled her hand away. "Buster, what's wrong?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. But the dog only stared at her with those empty eyes. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah lay awake in her own bed, listening to the sounds of the house around her. The wind outside howled, but it wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was Buster. She heard him pacing in the hallway, his claws clicking against the wooden floors in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Sarah frowned and glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Getting out of bed, she walked down the hallway, her footsteps light and careful. When she reached the living room, she stopped. Buster was standing there, staring at the front door, his back stiff and his body tense. The strange growl he made earlier echoed in Sarah's memory, and a chill ran down her spine. "Buster?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't respond. His eyes, those deep, dark eyes, remained fixed on the door. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she took a slow step toward the dog. His body was tense, unmoving, as if he were waiting for something or someone. The air in the room felt colder, the shadows darker. "Buster?" she called again, this time with more force. But the dog didn't react. His eyes never left the door. A sudden, unsettling thought crossed Sarah's mind. What if the man was right? What if this wasn't really Buster? She shook the thought away, trying to push through the unease. "Come on, boy. Let's go back to bed," she said gently, trying to coax him. But Buster didn't move. She stepped closer, reaching out a hand toward him. As her fingers brushed his fur, she felt an icy jolt, like she had touched something unnatural. His coat was still rough, the same way it had been when she first touched him. And yet there was something colder, something off about the way his body felt. Her hand lingered there for a moment longer than she intended. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the feeling passed. and she pulled her hand back, unnerved. "Come on, Buster," she said again, forcing a smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The dog's gaze was still fixed on the door, as if something were out there, just beyond the threshold. Without thinking, Sarah reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal. She turned it slowly, trying to calm herself, trying to dismiss the rising sense of dread crawling up her spine. When she opened the door, the night air hit her like a slap, biting cold and damp. The street lights outside cast long shadows over the yard, but there was nothing in sight. No figure, no movement, just the stillness of a suburban night. "Nothing," she whispered to herself. "Nothing out there." But as she turned to close the door, she caught sight of something, a dark shape, moving in the corner of her eye. Sarah froze, heart hammering in her chest. She turned her head slowly, her breath caught in her throat. There, just at the edge of the yard, was Buster. But it wasn't quite him. The dog was standing still, facing away from her, his back arched unnaturally, his limbs too stiff, his fur looking even more matted than before. His tail hung limp at his side, unmoving. He didn't look like Buster at all. He looked like something else. Something wrong. "Buster?" she whispered again, voice barely audible. The dog didn't turn. He remained perfectly still, almost as if he were waiting. Sarah's chest tightened, the air feeling thick with something malevolent, something that shouldn't be there. She took a step forward, but then stopped. There was a strange sound, a low, rasping growl. It wasn't the normal growl Buster would make when he was playing or excited. No, this was deeper, slower, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just from the dog. "Buster?" she called one last time, but the dog remained unmoving. She couldn't see his eyes from this distance, but the feeling of being watched crawled over her skin, making her shiver. "Buster, come inside," she said firmly, her voice cracking slightly. She reached out, but just as her hand was about to touch the doorframe, a flash of motion startled her. The dog was gone, vanished into the darkness. "Where the hell did he go?" she muttered to herself. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel her instincts screaming at her to run, to leave. But she couldn't leave, not with the kids asleep in the house, not with Buster out there somewhere. She stepped outside, cautiously, calling out into the darkened yard. "Buster?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the thick night air. She strained her eyes, but saw nothing. Suddenly, she heard a faint click from behind her. She whipped around, heart racing, but the door was still wide open. Buster hadn't come back inside. The house felt wrong, empty in a way it had never felt before. She backed toward the door, hand outstretched. The dog was in the yard, watching her from the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It tilted its head slightly, as if it were waiting for her to make a move. But then, there was a sudden rustle from behind her. She turned around, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the living room, standing in the doorway, was Buster. But the dog in the yard had never moved. This dog, this thing, was not Buster. Sarah stumbled back, her back hitting the doorframe. The air felt thick with dread. There was no way Buster had made it back inside so quickly. And yet, here he was, standing right there, his eyes cold and empty, his fur still unnaturally rough. And then the other dog, the one in the yard, let out a long, low growl, one that sent a shiver through Sarah's entire body. Her mind raced. Was there more than one? Was it possible that the man had given her the wrong dog? No, she couldn't think about that now. She needed to get the kids, needed to lock the doors, and her thoughts were interrupted as Buster, her Buster, took a step toward her. But it wasn't Buster, was it? This dog was different. It moved too stiffly, too deliberately. It was staring at her, but there was nothing in those eyes, nothing warm or loving, just an empty, hollow stare. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And then it happened. The dog lunged. The dog lunged with unnatural speed, its body twisting in a way that didn't seem possible. Sarah barely had time to react, stumbling backward, her hands reaching out for anything to grab onto. The cold, trembling air pressed against her skin as she fell to the floor, the hard ground biting into her palms. Buster, if that's even what it was right above her now, its body blocking out the moonlight as it loomed over her. Its jaw opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth, far too many teeth for a normal dog. The growl it emitted wasn't just a growl. It was a screech, a horrible, bone-chilling noise that scraped against her nerves, freezing her in place. Her mind raced as she tried to push herself up, her hands struggling to find purchase on the wet, cold grass beneath her. The dog was getting closer, its breath hot and foul against her face, its dark eyes never blinking, just watching her. She could feel the weight of its gaze, the pressure building as if something far worse was going to happen. "Buster," she whispered weakly, the name coming out like a prayer. But the dog only snarled, its lips curling back. No recognition, no warmth. This was not her dog. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, suddenly echoed from behind her, and Sarah froze. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to see what was coming. But she had no choice. Slowly, carefully, she twisted her neck to glance back at the doorway. Standing there was another figure, another version of Buster, its body stretched unnaturally tall, its fur matted and clumped together. It was not a dog at all. It looked wrong, twisted, as if it had been made from the remnants of her real dog and something else, something dark and twisted. This one was staring at her too, its eyes glowing faintly, like two small embers in a pit. It was silent, watching with cold indifference, as if it were waiting for something. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her side as the first creature, her Buster, lunged again, its teeth sinking into her arm. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, the yard now feeling impossibly quiet. Her blood pooled against her skin, seeping into the grass. The pain was overwhelming, but it didn't matter anymore. She was beyond that now. The dog's grip tightened, dragging her toward the shadows. Then she saw it, just a flicker, a flash of movement. A shadow creeping up from behind her, from the far corner of the yard. Someone, or something, was watching her from the darkness. The shape was tall, too tall, and as it moved forward, she realized it was not human. It was tall, thin, with elongated limbs that stretched far beyond what was natural. Its face was distorted, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface with jagged cracks running through it. It was as if the thing wasn't supposed to be real, and yet, here it was. The dog's grip loosened for just a moment as Sarah's eyes locked onto the thing in the distance. It was coming closer now, moving toward her with a quiet, almost unnatural speed. There was something deeply wrong about the way it moved, like it wasn't part of this world. The dog let out a low whine, its teeth retracting for a brief second, giving Sarah the chance she needed. She twisted free, gasping for breath as she scrambled away. Her legs were weak, her body battered and bruised, but adrenaline fueled her forward. She sprinted back toward the door, toward the safety of her house, but as she neared it, she felt a cold hand grip her ankle. The second dog, the one standing in the doorway, had moved with terrifying swiftness, its long, twisted form wrapping around her like a vice. "Let go!" Sarah cried out, kicking wildly, trying to break free, but it wouldn't release her. It was too strong. The figure in the yard moved closer, its long arms reaching out, its fingers impossibly long, stretching toward her. And then just as suddenly as it had all started, everything stopped. The dog at her ankle loosened its grip and vanished into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. The creature in the yard, the one with the broken face, stopped advancing. The air grew still. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, trembling from head to toe, trying to process what had just happened. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get inside, to do something, but she couldn't move. Her limbs felt numb, her mind unable to form a coherent thought. She finally forced herself to turn around and face the door, But before she could take a step, she heard it. A low, guttural growl. It came from inside. The real Buster, the dog she had known for years, the dog who had always been there for her, was growling from the other side of the door. She could hear it clearly, hear it pacing. The growl wasn't threatening, but it was filled with an eerie sense of knowing. With shaking hands, Sarah reached for the door handle, her heart racing. What would she find behind it? Was the dog inside still Buster? Or had it been replaced too, like the others? As the door opened slowly, the soft light from inside spilled out, revealing the hallway. Buster was sitting in the middle of the room, his fur still matted, his eyes still lifeless. But when he looked at her, he tilted his head slightly, just like he used to when he was confused or curious. His body relaxed, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. But just as quickly, the eerie feeling crept back. Something wasn't right. And then, with a sudden, horrifying realization, Sarah saw it. The reflection in the hallway mirror. Buster was there too. Only the one in the mirror was different. It wasn't her dog. It was something else entirely. She let out a scream, but before the sound could escape, everything went black. When Sarah regained consciousness, it wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was dark, the air damp and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Her mind was disoriented, her thoughts jumbled as she tried to make sense of where she was. The last thing she remembered was the reflection, the wrong Buster staring back at her, and then everything went dark. Now she was lying on something soft, grass? She didn't know. She tried to sit up but felt a sharp pain in her side, and when she looked down, she saw blood staining her clothes. Her chest tightened as she looked around, eyes darting to the shadowed corners of what seemed to be an unfamiliar place. It was an empty field, or at least it appeared to be. The sky above was overcast, the clouds thick and oppressive, blocking out the stars. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. Not even the wind stirred. Everything was too quiet. Then she heard it, the growl. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew closer until it was right beside her. She flinched, her body frozen with fear. She turned, heart hammering in her chest. Buster. But it wasn't him. It was the thing that had been masquerading as him. The thing that had looked like her dog, but wasn't. Its eyes glowed faintly, those same dark pits that swallowed all the light, and its body was twisted, still too long and far too unnaturally shaped. Its jaws were wide, dripping with a viscous black liquid that ran from its mouth and pooled onto the ground beneath it. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring every moment of Sarah's terror. Her breath hitched, the air feeling thicker with every second that passed. It was closing in, and she had no idea where she was or how to escape. "Stay away," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely a sound. But the creature didn't respond. It never did. It just watched her, its gaze unwavering, the growl low and constant. Behind it, Sarah caught movement. More figures, tall, thin, broken. Shadows that shifted unnaturally in the corners of her vision, their bodies flickering in and out of focus, like they didn't belong in this world. Each step they took sent tremors through the ground, as though the earth itself was shuddering beneath them. Her head spun. She had to get out. She had to move. But how? Everything around her felt wrong. She was trapped in some nightmare, and she couldn't wake up. As she struggled to push herself up from the ground, the creature, Buster, or whatever it was, stepped closer, its jaws snapping. She barely had time to react before it lunged. Her body moved on instinct, and she managed to roll out of its path just in time. She gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest, her limbs heavy and sore, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her. She pushed herself to her feet, her body screaming in protest as she staggered forward, desperately searching for something, anything, that could help her. But there was nothing. The field stretched on endlessly, and the creatures behind her grew louder, closer. With a burst of energy, Sarah ran. Her feet pounded against the hard earth as she sprinted through the darkness, her breath ragged. each step more painful than the last. The creatures followed, their growls growing louder, more insistent. There was no escape. Ahead, she saw it. A figure, human, or at least it seemed to be. She didn't know who or what it was, but it was standing still, waiting for her, unmoving. "Help me!" Sarah cried out, her voice hoarse. But the figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching her. She stumbled toward it, almost falling, but when she reached out to grab hold of the person's arm, her hand passed through it, like it was made of smoke. She froze, her mind trying to comprehend what had just happened. The figure vanished. Then, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell, plummeting downward, her body twisting as she tried to grab onto anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. Darkness consumed her once more, and she felt herself sinking deeper, farther into something ancient and cold. She awoke again, this time in her own bed. The sheets were tangled around her, and the room was dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp on the nightstand. Her breathing was erratic, her chest heaving as she sat up, heart racing. It felt real. The dream, or whatever it was, had felt so real. But there was something else. A shadow moved across the wall, just outside her window. Sarah turned toward the source of the movement, her eyes wide in terror. Was it back? Could it be? No. She couldn't let herself believe that. She had to be dreaming. But what if she wasn't? The shadows danced across the window, and then a soft, familiar sound reached her ears. The sound of paws. Buster. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the window, but when she peered outside, all she saw was darkness. The yard was empty. Nothing. But then she heard it again. The scratch at the door, faint but unmistakable. Buster. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she slowly, cautiously, turned toward the door. Her legs felt like lead as she crossed the room, each step heavier than the last. She reached for the doorknob. Her fingers trembled as she touched it, the cold metal biting into her skin. She could hear the scratching again, growing louder, more insistent. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. There was nothing. The hallway was dark, silent, except for the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, and then the growl. She turned back, but there, in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was Buster. The creature that had once been her dog. The thing that had never left. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, locked onto her, its body crouched low, ready to pounce. And Sarah realized, with a sickening certainty, that it was never going to stop. It had never been about finding her dog. It had been about something else entirely, and now she was its prey. As Sarah stood frozen, her heart thundering in her chest, the room seemed to shrink around her. The shadows where Buster stood twisted, like they were alive, pulsating with a dark, sickly energy. Her eyes locked onto his, but those familiar, once loving eyes were no longer there. Instead, they were empty pits, like a black hole that seemed to draw in all light and warmth. The creature, a twisted reflection of her dog, let out a low growl, its mouth widening into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if she were paralyzed, her limbs heavy, as though something invisible was pressing down on her chest, holding her in place. The growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through her bones. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as though the creature's presence was distorting reality itself. The walls seemed to close in, the floor felt unsteady beneath her feet, and the silence was replaced by the sound of the creature's breathing, raspy and uneven, as it crept toward her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but all she could do was stand there, her throat tight, her eyes wide with terror, as the creature slowly, deliberately advanced toward her. It was close now, too close, and just as she thought she couldn't bear it anymore, she heard a voice. Weak, distant, but unmistakably human. Sarah? Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It was her mother's. "Mom!" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned toward the sound of the voice, but the hallway was still empty. The only thing that remained was Buster, still staring at her with those cold, lifeless eyes. The growl intensified, its resonance filling her ears as the creature lunged, snapping its jaws inches from her face. The sound was deafening. A sickening wet crunch echoed through the air as it missed her, the force of its movement sending a blast of cold air across the room. Sarah stumbled backward, crashing into the wall, barely able to regain her balance before the creature lunged again. This time she ducked. Her heart raced as she crawled away, her hands scraping against the floor as she scrambled toward the door. Her fingertips grazed the doorknob, but as she twisted it, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her, making her chest tighten. She was trapped. There was no way out. Behind her, the creature let out another growl, followed by a sickening snarl as it began to circle her. Sarah's breath was shallow, ragged, as she frantically pulled at the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't move. The world around her felt unreal, like she was trapped in some twisted nightmare where nothing obeyed the laws of reality. Then from somewhere deep inside, a voice, her own, or something else's, pushed its way to the surface. A whisper that seemed to cut through the fear and the darkness. "You're not alone." The words were strange, cryptic, but they held a weight, like a key to something she couldn't yet understand. The creature was circling closer now, its claws scraping against the floor. It was so close. Sarah could feel its hot breath on her skin. The air seemed to grow colder, and a wave of dread washed over her, paralyzing her with fear. She had to move. With a final, desperate surge of energy, she shoved against the door with all her strength. To her surprise, it swung open, and she fell forward, crashing to the ground in the hallway. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding, and ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay there. She couldn't face that thing again. Down the hallway she ran, the sound of the creature's footsteps following close behind her, relentless. But something was different this time. As she rounded a corner, the hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally before her. The walls closed in, and the ceiling seemed to drop lower with each step. The space around her warped and twisted as if the very building itself were alive, pulling her deeper into its clutches. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, but she kept running, her breath ragged, the sound of her footsteps echoing louder and louder in her ears. She turned another corner and found herself standing at the top of a staircase. The stairs descended into blackness, an endless abyss that seemed to call to her. Without thinking, she ran down the stairs, her feet pounding against the steps, faster and faster, until she was falling, stumbling, tumbling headfirst into the dark void below. The world spun, and for a moment, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself in a different place. A room, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Her surroundings looked strange, unfamiliar, like an office building, but not the one she recognized. The walls were cracked, the floor stained with something dark, and the air was heavy, oppressive. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, heavy. She turned, expecting to see the creature, Buster, the thing that was never really her dog. But what she saw instead made her blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man. His face was obscured by shadows, his features indistinct, but there was something familiar about him. His eyes, though, those eyes were unmistakable. They were Buster's eyes. "Sarah," the figure whispered, its voice a low rasp that made her skin crawl. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The creature, Buster, stepped closer, its body contorting, shifting, as it came into full view. It wasn't just the dog anymore. It was something worse, something far more terrifying. Its face, once a grotesque reflection of her pet, was now a twisted mockery of a man's. Its skin was pale, cracked, as if it had been stitched together from pieces of different bodies. It was wearing Buster's skin, and as the thing in front of her spoke again, Sarah knew. It had never been the dog. The dog had been taken, replaced, and whatever was standing in front of her now was something much darker. The door slammed shut behind her. There was nowhere to run, and no one was coming to help. The thing before her, Buster's skin stretched over a nightmare, moved closer, its steps deliberate, its head cocked slightly to one side. Sarah's heart raced, every beat loud in her ears. She felt cold sweat trickling down her back as she backed away, eyes locked on the monstrosity that was once her beloved dog. "Buster?" she whispered, the word leaving her mouth like a prayer, but she knew it was useless. This thing was not her dog. It was something else, something ancient and cruel that had taken on his form to torment her. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, half growl, half laugh, as it crouched in front of her. It sniffed the air, its breath hot and fetid, sending a wave of nausea through Sarah. It opened its mouth, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and licked its lips slowly. "You shouldn't have looked for me," it said, the voice a distorted mix of Buster's familiar bark and something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. It knew her too well. How long had it been watching? Had it been in her home, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Was this thing the reason her dog had gone missing in the first place? "No," she whispered, shaking her head, trying to push the thought away. "You're not him." The creature didn't respond with words this time. Instead, it reached out with its clawed hand, its nails long and twisted like broken shards of bone, and grabbed her by the wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. It pulled her closer, forcing her to look into its black, soulless eyes. "You should have left it alone," it said again, the words like a warning, a final command. "You should have never tried to find him." Sarah struggled against its hold, her pulse pounding in her temples, but it was no use. The thing was too strong. The more she fought, the tighter its grip became, until she couldn't feel her wrist anymore. It was as if the very air around her was growing heavier, suffocating her with an unbearable weight. And then, in a sudden burst of movement, the creature jerked her toward it, its mouth opening wide as if to swallow her whole. Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the thing's foul, rancid breath. She was pulled in closer and closer, and for a moment, she thought this was it. This was how it would end. But just as its teeth were about to sink into her neck, something unexpected happened. The lights above flickered. The ground trembled beneath her feet. The creature froze, its expression one of confusion, before it let out a low, tortured growl. "No, no, not again." And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the shadows, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dark, gasping for breath. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling, her heart still racing. What had just happened? Had it been a hallucination? A nightmare? No, the fear in her bones told her it had been real. It had been real, and whatever it had been, was still out there somewhere. Her wrist burned where it had been gripped, and she looked down to see the imprint of the creature's fingers still visible on her skin. With shaking hands, she pulled herself to her feet, her legs weak beneath her, but she had to move. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was still lurking in the darkness. Sarah turned and ran, her feet barely touching the floor as she fled through the empty hallways of the strange building, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stop. The door had to be somewhere. She rounded a corner and slammed into someone. The force of the collision sent her tumbling backward, and she landed hard on the floor, breath knocked from her chest. Gasping for air, she looked up, expecting to see the creature, but it wasn't the creature. It was a man, a stranger, tall and thin, with dark hair and a pale face. He was looking down at her, an unreadable expression on his face. His eyes, just like Buster's, were empty, void of any emotion. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached out a hand, helping her to her feet with an unnatural gentleness. His touch was cold, his skin clammy, and she recoiled instinctively. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice growing more desperate. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't speak, but instead, he gestured toward the end of the hallway. His movements were jerky, mechanical, like he was being controlled by something beyond his own will. "Don't!" Sarah shouted, backing away. "Stay away from me!" But the man continued to move toward her, his hands reaching out as if to grab her once more. She turned and ran, the fear bubbling up inside her again. She couldn't stop. She couldn't look back. She could hear his footsteps following her, slow and deliberate, echoing in the darkened hallways. Then in the distance she saw it. The door. The exit. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would burst from her chest. She reached for the doorknob, but as her fingers closed around it, she felt something hold her back. Something invisible. A force that made it impossible for her to turn the knob. She looked over her shoulder and saw the man standing there, still approaching, his eyes empty and dark. He smiled a twisted, hollow smile. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing in the hall. Sarah's body went cold. She realized, with horrifying clarity, that she had been running in circles all along. She wasn't going to escape. There was no exit. This place was a trap, a prison, and she was never meant to leave. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't the thumping of fear that sent a shiver through her. It was the crushing realization there was no escape. She had been running in circles. The door, the hallway, the stranger, all of it was part of the nightmare. There was no way out. The man's cold, hollow eyes locked with hers. His smile deepened, twisted in a way that made her stomach churn. He wasn't human, not anymore. He was one of them. "You'll never leave," he repeated, his voice low and steady, like he was delivering a final truth. She felt her knees weaken, her legs trembling as she backed up, helplessly watching him close the distance. The space between them felt suffocating. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch toward her, as though they were alive, inching closer with every passing second. "No, no, please!" Sarah cried out, but her voice sounded hollow in the dark room. She had no more strength to fight, no more energy to scream. The man stopped just in front of her, his cold hand lifting as if to touch her face. But as his fingers grazed her skin, she felt an icy chill run through her, a deep, gnawing coldness that burned, worse than any fire. It spread through her veins, freezing her from the inside out. She gasped, her vision blurring, her body trembling violently. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, unable to move. Her chest tightened, and she couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her, squeezing the life out of her. The man's voice echoed in her ears again. "You're just like them. You'll never leave. You'll never go home." The last thing she saw before everything went black was the man's face looming over her, the twisted smile never leaving his lips. When she awoke, the world was still. The darkness around her was suffocating. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they were no longer her own. Her fingers twitched. She could feel her heartbeat, but it was faint, distant. She could hear a low whimper in the air, an almost familiar sound like a soft, muffled bark. A flicker of hope sparked in her chest. "Buster?" Her head spun as she tried to sit up, but when her eyes opened fully, what she saw made her blood run cold. She was no longer in the hallway, no longer in the office building. The walls around her were familiar, too familiar. She was in her own home. But it wasn't the way she left it. The furniture was askew, the lights dimmed to a faint glow, and the air, it smelled wrong, stale and suffocating. The sound of something scratching at the door echoed in the room, soft but persistent. It wasn't Buster's bark anymore. It was something deeper, something inhuman. As the door creaked open, she saw the shadow first. Long and stretched, moving in a way that didn't belong to anything alive. The shape took form, and for a moment she thought she saw her dog's eyes, glowing, dark, lifeless. But then the shape came closer, revealing the thing that had once been her dog, its fur matted and twisted, its body unnaturally still. The thing had changed. It was no longer Buster. She froze, terror clawing at her throat as it moved toward her. It didn't bark, didn't whimper. It simply stared, its eyes black voids that sucked in all light. Sarah felt her pulse race, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't move. The thing slowly circled her, like a predator sizing up its prey, before it stopped right in front of her. It opened its mouth, and she heard it speak, its voice a hollow whisper that scraped against her mind. "You should have left us alone." And in that moment she understood. She had never been the hunter. She had never been searching for her lost dog. She had been the prey. The thing that had taken Buster was still with her, still lingering, waiting to finish what it started. There was no escape. No way out. The thing lunged. The room grew darker, colder, as if the shadows themselves were swallowing her whole. And then silence. Name of the next story, The Wrong Number. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Alex sat down on his couch, feeling the weight of the long day settle into his shoulders. The apartment was still, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the TV screen in front of him. It had been 3 years since his father passed away, and although the grief had faded with time, there were still moments when it felt like a raw wound just beneath the surface. Tonight was one of those nights. Alex stretched his legs out and grabbed his phone, scrolling mindlessly through the endless notifications from work emails, social media posts, and group chats. He paused as a text message popped up on the screen, an unknown number flashing on the screen. It was a simple message. "Alex, it's your father. I miss you." For a moment, Alex blinked in disbelief. His thumb hovered over the screen, unsure whether he should respond. It had been years since he last heard his father's voice. The sudden surge of emotion made his heart ache, but his mind quickly rejected the possibility. His father had been dead for months, his funeral had been small, and his belongings had been packed up and donated long ago. There was no way this could be his father. Alex swallowed the lump in his throat and quickly typed a response. "Who is this?" He waited for a reply, his heart pounding in his chest. A few moments passed, and the screen lit up again. The message appeared as if the person had been waiting for him to ask. "It's really me. I know you're confused, but I'm here. I'm okay." Alex frowned. He stared at the message, unsure whether he should be frightened or curious. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but the tone of the text, familiar, personal, sent a chill down his spine. His father had always been direct in his communication, no matter how little he said. But this felt different, like it wasn't just a message, but a presence that had followed him into the room. This is some kind of sick joke, Alex thought. Who would do this? He typed back, "This isn't funny. My dad is dead. You need to stop." For a long time, there was no reply. Alex leaned back against the couch, letting the silence wash over him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he waited, his fingers gripped around the phone. Just as he was about to toss it aside, the phone vibrated again. He picked it up quickly, almost afraid to see what the next message would say. The message was short, almost too short to be serious. "I know you're angry. You never forgave me, did you?" Alex's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced back to the moments before his father passed away. The arguments, the unspoken words, the unresolved tension that had festered between them. There had been so many things left unsaid, so many things Alex wished he could have changed before it was too late. His hands shook as he typed a reply. "What do you mean?" The next response came almost immediately. "You never forgave me for not being there, for the way I treated you when you were younger." Alex's stomach twisted. He hadn't thought about that part of his life in years. His father hadn't been the easiest man to live with. Alex remembered the long nights, The times he would sit in his room, listening to his parents argue, feeling helpless and alone. His father's temper had been unpredictable, and he had often been cold, distant. Alex had spent most of his childhood wondering why his father wasn't more like the other dads, the ones who played catch with their sons, who showed up to parent-teacher conferences, who didn't disappear into their own worlds when they were needed most. He hadn't forgiven his father. Not truly. The bitterness still lingered, even in his adulthood. But now, looking at the text on the screen, Alex felt a strange pang of regret. Hadn't he wished for this? To hear his father admit he'd been wrong. Before he could think more about it, another message appeared. I wasn't a good father, was I? Alex's breath caught in his throat. His hands were clammy, and his mind felt foggy. The familiarity of the words, the tone, was unmistakable. It was his father's voice, or at least it sounded like him. But how? How could this be happening? He typed, "How are you texting me right now?" Another message came through. It's hard to explain, but I had to tell you the truth. The truth about everything. A cold shiver ran down Alex's spine. He thought about it for a moment. His father's death had been sudden, unexpected. There had been no warning, no time to make amends. His father had passed away in his sleep, a stroke taking him in an instant. No one had expected it. Not his mother, not his siblings, no one. But there had been things that Alex had never quite understood. The way his father's behavior had shifted toward the end of his life, the strange phone calls, the late-night drives. Alex had never confronted him about it, and now it seemed like he might never get the chance. Was this some final attempt to make peace? Or was it something else? The phone buzzed again. This time, the message was longer, and Alex could feel a chill creep into his bones as he read it. You remember the cabin, don't you? The one I told you about, the one I promised to take you to. Alex stared at the screen, confused. He had no memory of any cabin. His father had never mentioned anything like that. What was this? Some kind of trick? He typed back, "What cabin?" The response was chilling in its simplicity. "It's where I've been hiding. You need to come. You need to find me." A wave of panic surged through Alex. What was going on? How could his father be texting him? Why was he talking about some cabin? Alex's heart raced as he felt the weight of the words press against him. It was like something dark and unseen was pulling him in, and he couldn't escape. He typed again, his hands trembling. "Where is it?" The reply came quickly. "I can't tell you, but you'll know when the time comes." Alex's phone buzzed again. It was another text from the unknown number. "Do you remember the night you found my journal? The night you read about the things I did?" The message struck him like a slap. His father's journal. Alex remembered it. He had found it when he was a teenager, hidden in the back of his father's closet. He had read it in secret, sneaking away to the attic when no one was around. The journal had been filled with strange entries, talk of debts, of things his father had done in his youth, things that were unspeakable. Alex had been horrified and confused, and he'd never told anyone about what he'd read. He'd buried it all, pushed it to the back of his mind. But now the words from that journal were coming back to him. The things his father had written about, the strange men, the rituals, the promises made in the dark. You shouldn't have found it. Now you're part of it. Alex's mind reeled. The journal. He could still remember the smell of the yellowed pages, the ink that had bled into the fibers of the paper, as if the words had been written in a hurry, desperate to be preserved before they vanished into oblivion. He had tried to forget it, tried to move past it like everything else in his life. But now, reading the text on his phone, the memories rushed back with full force. You shouldn't have found it. Now you're part of it. The words echoed in his mind, and his heart skipped a beat. What was his father talking about? What was he a part of? His hands were trembling as he clutched the phone, his eyes scanning the message again, and then again, hoping that somehow it would change. But it didn't. The more he read it, the more he could feel his sanity unraveling. The next text came through. It was colder, more direct. You always thought it was just a story, something made up. But it wasn't. It was real. And you're going to have to face it. Alex's stomach twisted. He pressed his palm against his forehead, trying to calm the dizzying rush of fear and confusion. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. His father was dead. This was some sick joke, someone messing with his head. But the longer he stared at the phone, the more he realized it wasn't a prank. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about this whole situation. He typed quickly, his fingers unsteady on the screen. What is real? What are you talking about? The phone vibrated again, and Alex's breath hitched as he read the reply. The cabin, Alex. I'm in the cabin. You have to come. You have to finish it. Alex's body froze. The cabin. The words were like a whisper from a forgotten dream. He remembered something now, something buried deep within his mind. His father had mentioned it years ago, when Alex was just a child. He had been too young to understand then, but now, those words made his skin crawl. His father had talked about the cabin, about how it was special, a place that had to be kept secret, a place that was only for those who understood. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His breath was shallow. Finish it. What did that mean? The rituals. You saw the journal, didn't you? The next message was brief, to the point. It's time. The door is waiting for you. Alex could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. His mind raced, but he couldn't make sense of anything. The images from the journal, the strange drawings, the cryptic notes about passing on the legacy. It all came crashing back in an overwhelming rush. He had dismissed it all as the ramblings of a man losing his grip on reality. But now it was as if his father had been trying to warn him. Or worse, draw him into something much darker than he could have ever imagined. You have to come, Alex. I'm waiting for you. The next message was different. It wasn't just a text anymore. A photo attached. Alex stared at the image, his breath catching in his throat. It was a photo of a cabin in the woods, surrounded by thick trees. But it wasn't just any cabin. The structure was old, dilapidated, like something out of a nightmare. The windows were boarded up, and there was an unnatural stillness to the scene, as if it was waiting for someone to come. Alex's hands shook as he stared at the photo, his mind racing. He didn't know where this place was. He had never seen it before. Yet it felt familiar. The darkness of the trees, the twisted shape of the structure. It was as though it had always been in his mind, always lurking there, waiting to be discovered. His finger hovered over the phone, torn between running away, blocking the number, and following his father's strange request. Was it a sign? Was this a test? A way for him to redeem himself after all these years? Or was this something else entirely? A sinister force trying to pull him into something he could never escape? He typed a reply, barely able to form coherent thoughts. What do you want from me? The answer came quickly, chillingly clear. To finish what I started. To finish what we started. Alex swallowed hard, feeling his breath catch in his throat. We? What did that mean? What had they started? The next text was different. There was no message this time, only a phone number. A long string of numbers with no context, no explanation. Alex stared at it, confusion growing. He tried to make sense of it, but his mind couldn't keep up. The numbers didn't make any sense. He tried to remember where he had seen something similar before, but nothing came to mind. It was just a number, a random sequence of digits. But somehow it felt significant, important, like it had a purpose. Call me when you're ready, the final message read. Alex's throat tightened. Call me when you're ready. The words echoed in his mind. Ready for what? A part of him wanted to delete everything, to toss the phone aside and never look back. But another part, the part of him that had always yearned for closure, for answers, was pulling him forward. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. The phone, the messages, the cabin, it was all leading him somewhere. Somewhere he couldn't avoid. Somewhere he needed to go. He glanced at the photo again, his eyes tracing the contours of the building, the creeping sense of dread settling in his stomach. A voice inside him told him not to go, to run as far as he could. But another voice, one that sounded eerily like his father's, told him he had no choice. He stood up, feeling his legs shake. His fingers trembled as he held the phone, staring at the number. His father's voice was now in his head, and it was impossible to shake. It was as if his father was calling to him from beyond the grave. There was no escaping it. Finally, Alex made his decision. He pressed the dial button. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice, soft, raspy, answered on the other end. "Alex, I knew you'd come." The words were just a whisper, but they seemed to vibrate through his bones. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he gripped the phone tighter. "Come to the cabin, son. It's time." Before he could respond, the line went dead. Alex stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The words echoed in his head. "It's time." He dropped the phone to the floor, staring at the dark screen. Was he ready? Could he really do this? Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. The cabin awaited, and somewhere, deep in the darkness, his father was waiting too. Alex didn't bother packing a bag or even telling anyone where he was going. Something inside him, the part that had always been curious, always searching for answers, was pushing him forward. He was already too deep into whatever this was. His mind was numb, as if detached from his body. The heavy weight of the phone in his pocket felt like an anchor to some invisible force pulling him toward an inevitable destination. He stepped into his car and started the engine, the hum of the motor vibrating through his chest. The road ahead was empty, the world outside his window blurred with the soft glow of streetlights. The night seemed unusually quiet, as if everything had gone to sleep, holding its breath in anticipation. Alex's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He hadn't driven far when the first message came through again. "I can hear you, Alex. Keep going. You're almost there." He nearly swerved off the road, his heart leaping into his throat. His father's voice, now an eerie echo through the text, sent a chill through his spine. The words were haunting, too intimate, as if his father was right beside him in the car, breathing on his neck. Alex's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to focus on the road, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator. He couldn't stop now. Not after everything. Not after hearing that voice, feeling that presence that had been missing for so long. The landscape outside his window began to change. The trees grew thicker, the street lights faded into darkness, and the road became more uneven. It wasn't long before the pavement disappeared entirely, leaving only a narrow dirt path that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The phone buzzed again. This time, the text was simple but carried a weight that nearly broke him. "I'm waiting." Alex swallowed hard. A lump formed in his throat. He wasn't sure what he expected, some grand revelation, maybe, or a confrontation that would explain everything. But what he felt now wasn't like anything he had ever anticipated. It was something deeper, darker, as if the world around him had folded in on itself, and he was standing at the center of a nightmare he didn't understand. The cabin wasn't far now. He could feel it. He could feel the pull, like gravity was warping and drawing him in. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the branches groan and creak, as if the forest itself was alive and watching him approach. Suddenly, the headlights of the car illuminated something up ahead, a small, weathered building at the edge of the woods, hidden deep in the shadows. It was almost impossible to see clearly, but there was no mistaking it. This was it, the cabin. Alex's heart pounded as he pulled the car to a stop. The engine died, leaving the silence of the night to envelop him. The air smelled different here, musty damp, as if the place had been forgotten for years, maybe decades. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the cabin, his mind racing. He could hear the sound of his own breath, shallow and quick. His hands trembled as he reached for the door, the cold metal of the handle biting into his palm. He hesitated for a moment longer. What if it was a mistake? What if this was all some twisted illusion, some sick joke meant to drive him mad? But deep down, he knew that running wasn't an option anymore. There was no going back. He stepped out of the car and stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin. The trees loomed over him, their twisted branches swaying in the wind, blocking out most of the moonlight. Everything felt wrong. The darkness pressed in on him like a physical force. It was as if the very air was alive, watching him, waiting. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Alex whipped around, his heart racing. But there was no one there. He glanced around the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Another message came through. "You're late." Alex's fingers hovered over the phone, his heart hammering in his chest. The words were like a curse, a subtle accusation that sank deep into his soul. How could he be late? Hadn't he come exactly as his father had asked? Hadn't he followed every instruction, step by step? He walked toward the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if something was pulling at his ankles, dragging him down. He reached the door, the wood rough under his fingertips. It was old, weathered, and covered in vines, but still standing, still there, just as it had been in his memories. He pushed the door open with a creak, and the inside of the cabin greeted him with an overwhelming sense of decay. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and rot filled his nostrils. The place felt like it hadn't been lived in for years, maybe longer. Broken furniture lay scattered around the room. An old armchair, a cracked mirror, a wooden table that had long since lost its shine. A faint light flickered from the back of the cabin. Alex stepped inside, his pulse quickening as he followed the dim glow. The room seemed to stretch unnaturally, the walls seeming to close in as he moved forward. His father's voice echoed again, not in his mind this time, but as a whisper through the air. "It's time, Alex. You can't leave until it's done." Alex's hand brushed against the wall as he made his way deeper into the cabin. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run out of there as fast as he could, but his legs wouldn't listen. His feet moved on their own, toward the source of the light, toward the thing that was calling him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the cabin itself were alive, urging him forward. He rounded the corner, and there, in the middle of the room, stood an old, rusted door. It was ajar just barely, but the light, sickly and greenish, was seeping out through the crack. Alex's body trembled as he took another step forward, unable to stop himself, unable to turn away. He knew that whatever was behind that door, whatever had been waiting for him all these years, was now within his reach. And it wasn't going to let him go. He reached out, and the moment his hand touched the cold metal doorknob, the whispering stopped. Dead silence. The cabin held its breath. Everything hung in the balance as Alex slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, but as he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. And then, everything went dark. For a moment, there was nothing. Complete darkness. Not even the faintest hint of light. Alex's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He stood there, frozen, unable to move, unsure of what was happening. The silence pressed against him, suffocating him, as if the air itself had been stolen from the room. His hands, trembling, reached out in front of him, but he couldn't feel a thing. No walls, no floor, no ceiling. Just emptiness. Then a sound. It was faint at first, like the creaking of old wood, the kind you might hear in a forgotten attic, but it grew louder, closer. A rhythmic thumping, as if someone or something was walking toward him. His pulse surged in his throat. He wanted to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. His legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the ground. The thumping continued, louder now, each step more pronounced than the last. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was coming for him. Suddenly, the darkness lifted, like a curtain being drawn back. Light spilled into the room, harsh and blinding. It took Alex a moment to adjust his eyes, to make sense of the sudden change. And when he did, his stomach dropped. He was no longer in the cabin. The walls were gone. The floor beneath him was cold, hard stone. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. He was in a tunnel, a long, narrow passageway that stretched into the darkness on either side. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time, but unmistakably eerie. The floor was uneven, covered in patches of moss, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, desperately trying to make sense of his surroundings. His fingers grazed the walls, the stone cold under his touch. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift as his eyes moved, as if they were alive, watching him. His skin prickled with an unmistakable sense of dread. Then the voice came again, not through his phone, but in the air surrounding him. It was his father's voice, low, distorted, like it was being pulled through an old radio. "You always did want to know the truth, didn't you, Alex?" the voice said, the words slithering into his mind like poison. Alex's body went rigid. His heart pounded harder in his chest, the blood roaring in his ears. He couldn't breathe. His father's voice, so familiar and so terrifying, seemed to echo off the walls. The sound grew louder, until it was all around him, suffocating him. "You don't understand yet, do you? You never have." The words twisted in his mind, making his head ache. He staggered backward, his hand pressing against the cold stone wall for support. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words, the voice, had him trapped. His thoughts were spiraling towards something dark, something ancient. And then he saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the tunnel. A silhouette, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. It was tall, too tall. Its body was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden in shadow. But Alex could see the shape of it, the movement, as it stepped forward slowly, deliberately toward him. "Don't run, Alex," his father's voice warned, too calm, too knowing. "You won't escape." Alex's body snapped into motion before he could even think. His legs carried him forward, racing down the tunnel, the sound of his feet slapping against the stone floor the only noise in the world. He could feel the air growing colder, the shadows lengthening as if the tunnel itself was alive, reaching for him. The whispers, now not only from his father but from something else, something more sinister, pulsed in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, the figure was always there, just behind him, its presence like a suffocating weight. It was closing in slowly, inexorably. Every time Alex glanced over his shoulder, the figure was closer, its shape more defined, the eyes, those empty, glowing eyes, staring right through him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His body was moving on pure instinct now, each step desperate, each breath a rasp in his throat. The walls seemed to narrow, the tunnel becoming smaller and smaller, as if the very place was trying to trap him. And then the figure spoke again, its voice low, guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. "You've always been mine, Alex. Always." A cold wave of dread washed over him, so deep, so bone-chilling that it froze him in place. His heart stopped, the world narrowing into nothing but the sound of his pulse, the beating of a heart he could no longer feel. And in that moment, Alex understood. He understood what had been happening all along. The messages, the voice, the feeling of being watched, of being led down this path, it had all been part of the same thing. He had never been free, not even after his father died. The truth had been buried, but it had never gone away. It had always been there, waiting for him to find it. He wasn't alone in the tunnel. There was something else with him, something far older than he was, something that had been watching him long before he had ever received the first message. It had always been watching. Alex's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the cold stone floor, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself up. The figure was almost upon him now, its form filling the tunnel, its eyes glowing like twin orbs of fire. It was almost time. "You're finally here," it whispered, its voice a low rumble that vibrated through Alex's bones. "Welcome home." The ground beneath Alex's hands cracked open, the earth splitting wide, as if the very tunnel was devouring him. A cold wind howled around him, pulling at his body, dragging him toward the void below. His eyes widened in terror as the darkness swallowed him whole, and the last thing he heard was his father's voice, laughing softly in the distance. "You were never meant to leave." And then there was nothing. As the messages grew more personal and disturbing, Michael's mind began to unravel. The words in the texts weren't just recounting his life, they were threatening his very existence. And then, after another chilling message that read, "I know what you did to me, Michael," he snapped. The walls were closing in. He couldn't just keep ignoring the situation any longer. It was clear, the text messages were not from his father. It was something else, something dark and insidious that had found a way into his life. But how? And why now, after all these years? Michael's fear had transformed into anger. He had to end this, whatever it was. The text had come from an unknown number, and the trail he had followed earlier seemed to lead nowhere. The more he tried to make sense of the situation, the more elusive the answers became. He had scoured his father's belongings, looked at every old photo, and searched the house for clues, but there was nothing that linked his father to the messages. That is, until he found an old journal his father had kept. It was hidden in the attic, in a dusty box buried beneath other old keepsakes. When he opened it, the handwriting was unmistakable, his father's. But the entries weren't just normal reflections. They were erratic, almost frantic at times. One in particular stood out. "They're watching. They've always been watching. I thought they were gone, but they never left. I can feel them in the walls, in the floorboards. You'll see them too soon, Michael. You will. You must be ready." The chilling words sent a shiver down his spine. Who were they? What had his father been afraid of? The journal also mentioned a place, a location his father had been to frequently, a cabin in the woods. Michael didn't remember ever hearing about it. Why had his father never mentioned it? Determined to confront whatever this was, Michael decided he had to go to the cabin. He had no idea what he'd find, but there was no other choice. He couldn't keep running from these messages. He drove out of the city, following the directions written in the journal, and eventually found himself on a narrow, winding road leading deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to stretch toward him, blocking out the sun as the sky darkened. It was an eerie feeling, like the forest itself was alive and watching him. When he reached the cabin, it looked abandoned. It was old, the wood was weathered, and the windows were covered with thick layers of grime. But Michael could feel something oppressive, hovering in the air just beneath the surface. As he stepped inside, the creaking of the floorboards echoed through the silence. The air was thick, stagnant, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of mildew made him gag. He wandered through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Nothing made sense, no signs of anyone being there, but there was a palpable presence. And then, as he stepped into the back room, he saw it. A mirror on the far wall. The reflection was distorted, twisted. The room seemed to bend around it, the walls warping as if they were breathing. Suddenly his phone buzzed. His heart raced as he looked at the screen. Another text from the same unknown number. "You've finally come. But it's too late, Michael. I know everything. I know your deepest, darkest secret. And now you'll pay for it." Before he could respond, a figure appeared in the mirror. It was his father. Well, something that looked like his father, but its eyes were empty, hollow. It was like a puppet, lifeless, with strings pulling it to move. "Dad!" Michael whispered, barely able to breathe. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural motion that sent a wave of nausea through him. "You shouldn't have come here, Michael. I never wanted you to know. But now it's too late." The figure's voice was not his father's. It was a hollow, echoing version of it, a voice that didn't belong. Michael stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone vibrated again. "You should have listened to me. It's not too late for you, though. You can join us. Just step closer." Michael shook his head. He couldn't. He wouldn't fall for it. But the figure in the mirror began to move toward him, its eyes locked onto his. It stepped out of the glass shattering like ice. And then it was standing in front of him, grinning. Its smile was wide, too wide, and its teeth were sharp and yellow. He turned to run, but the cabin seemed to twist around him. The walls closed in. He was trapped. His phone buzzed again. The text was simple. "It's your turn now." Panic surged through Michael, but he couldn't move. The shadowy figure was behind him, its hand reaching out. He had no choice. He swung around, grabbing the first object he could find, a rusted old lantern, and smashed it against the figure's face. The figure let out a shriek, a sound that vibrated through his bones. It recoiled, stepping back, its grin fading. The shadows that had clung to it now writhed and hissed. The cabin shook, and Michael could feel the floor beneath his feet crack, as if the entire place were about to collapse. He grabbed his phone one last time, a final desperate thought sparking in his mind. He dialed the number he had been texting, the unknown one, and pressed the phone to his ear. The figure howled in rage, but Michael barely heard it over the static on the other end. A voice, his father's voice, whispered through the line, faint but unmistakable. "I never wanted this for you." "Dad!" Michael gasped, his voice trembling. But the line went dead. The shadows in the cabin writhed one last time, and then silence. The cabin was empty. The oppressive feeling was gone. For the first time in what felt like hours, Michael could breathe. When he returned home, Michael never spoke of what had happened in the cabin. The text stopped. The shadows ceased to haunt him. But there was one thing he couldn't explain. The small object that he found in his father's journal, nestled beneath the pages, a ring. A small, tarnished silver ring, with a symbol he didn't recognize. It sat on his desk, staring back at him, silent, but forever present. The shadow was never fully gone. But for now, he was free. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.